130 or even lower. This could put pressure on asset classes.
That's interesting. If the carry trade is over, I wonder why, you know, what drives yen strength? Isn't the idea that
I think it would be that bank. I think it would be that central bank finally getting behind their currency. I think. I don't know. I'm not an expert in this area.
I just have to do so many mental gymnastics to understand how this works. And, you know, Liz McCormick has been writing about this a little bit as well, saying that when the BOJ let yield curve control, when they let the longer end yield slip higher, that led to higher rates in the U.S. too.
Yes.
And I think it's not just about the bond price necessarily, but the carry trade is at the heart of it.
I think it is the carry trade really is such a big piece of it, because it just means that money that cheap money that had been, you know, to whatever degree that there has been bond buying, there really hasn't been. You know, another point though around bonds is I think that there is supposed to be more supply. That was something that happened at the end of July. At the end of July, you had the Fed surprising markets, although I'm not quite sure why, saying that they were going to sit around in watching and they could hike again. But at the same time, there were those auctions, a strong degree of supply. And I know I read somewhere that there's expected to be more supply again. So it seems like there's pressure on bonds in terms of price, which could send yields higher.
Very good. The yen right now, 149.06. It is higher today. So we make note of that. Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much for joining us. Abigail Doolittle, she follows the markets for Bloomberg, joining us here. All right, let's get back to Israel. We want to broaden our discussion out to kind of a geopolitical discussion of that region of the world, and we can do that with Ambassador Adam Early. He is a principal at Ibero American Consultants. He was a former U.S. ambassador to the Kingdom of Bahrain from 2007 to 2011, so he knows that part of the world. Ambassador, thanks so much for joining us here. I guess there's a million ways to go here. It seems like Israel is really ramping up its attacks in Gaza. One of the concerns, obviously, for the United States and others is, what is the risk right now, do you believe, of this kind of regional conflict, kind of and focused on Gaza, expanding into more of a regional conflict, bringing in other players? Where are we on that risk spectrum right now?
Well, it's already started, frankly. Over the last 2 weeks, you've seen pretty constant exchange of fire between Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon and Israeli forces in the north of Israel. It hasn't gotten as much attention as obviously the hostilities in Gaza, but both sides have suffered dozens of casualties on that front. And then the United States has been attacked dozens of times in the last couple of weeks. Its forces in Iraq and Syria have been attacked by drones and missiles fired by groups controlled by Iran in those territories. So, you know, I would call it not even a boil, but a kind of simmering of the pot, which we see as the heat rises. The question is, will it reach a high boil? And frankly, that's what the Biden administration is spending a lot of its time attending to.
I wonder, first I want to say that nothing justifies the attacks that we saw on October 7th from Hamas into Israel. And I don't want anyone to think that I'm going there. But did this whole tragedy evolve in a sense from the attempt of the U.S. to normalize relations between the Saudis and Israelis? I only ask because I saw, who's the New York Times columnist that you love so much? Tom Friedman, I think, wrote a piece saying, you know, when we saw a picture of an Israeli defense minister getting all suited up to pray in Jeddah, that it was sure to outrage the Arabic world.
Well, the short answer, in my opinion, is no. But remember, everything is connected, right? But the reason I'll explain why I say no, but at the same time, there's a connection. You know, this attack, which involved thousands of Palestinians invading Israel by air, through paragliding, land and sea, right? And seizing predetermined targets, right, was a complex operation that took Israel totally by surprise. Now, you don't do something like that without years of careful planning and preparation, right?
Good point. Yeah.
Okay. So the rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, it's only been in the last couple of months, right? So clearly Hamas has been planning this for a while, right? And one cannot say that the provocation or what set this in motion was Israel-Saudi normalization. However, and this is where the connection comes in, Hamas is competing for political power among the Palestinian and Arab street, let's say. So, they saw themselves as maybe getting outmaneuvered a little bit by Israel in its rapprochement with the Arab states, like Bahrain, like UAE, like Morocco, who were all signatories of the Abraham Accords, which is where we were trying to bring Saudi Arabia. So again, it's not unconnected, but at the same time, it's not Saudi related. It is basically peace related. In other words, Hamas, which is a military terrorist organization, doesn't benefit from peace, right?
Yep.
They only benefit from continued conflict.
Adam, I want to get your thoughts here on these hostages, because that is just a difficult situation for Israel. What is the role that Qatar is playing in this, and is there any scenario where this ends well?
There's been a lot of how should I put it? There's been a lot of steam being let off in the media and about Qatar. And, Qatar is a country that I know very well. I've worked in, and it's very complicated. But here's the bottom line. The bottom line is that Qatar's relationships with Hamas have come about at the request of and with the cooperation of the United States and Israel over the last 20 years, 15, 20 years. Why? Because Hamas is a terrorist organization. We can't deal with them. We need somebody who can, and we, meaning the United States and Israel, have chosen Qatar as our preferred intermediary. So when people say Qatar supports Hamas, that's really not fair, because Qatar is kind of doing us a favor in terms of being a channel to Hamas to help stop hostilities, help release hostages, help get money and supplies to Palestinian civilians. Now, what's different in the present conflict, really, is that the United States and Israel have decided, rightfully so, I believe, no more negotiations, no more business at all with Hamas. That's over. We've gone from, tolerating an inconvenience to needing to eliminate a serious threat. That puts Qatar in a difficult position. What they're trying to do, I think, again, with U.S. and Israeli cooperation, is negotiate the release of these hostages so that Israel can then go in and flatten Hamas. Will they succeed? I doubt it. Why? Because Hamas recognizes that the only thing standing between it and the full force of the Israeli military are 200 hostages.
So I wonder, that's problematic in Gaza. And then on the northern border with Lebanon, you've got Iran lobbing missiles in via its proxy, Hezbollah, right? And it looks like from the rhetoric, Mick Mulroy just told us from the Lobo Institute, he thinks Iran wants this conflict to broaden out. Is that inevitable as well?
I think that's a little simplistic, that Iran wants this conflict to broaden out. What does Iran want? Iran wants two things. It wants the United States out of the Middle East, and it wants Israel to be eliminated, right? At least if you believe what the Iranian leaders have been saying for the past 40 years. So the question for Iran is how to best achieve those objectives, right? Is it by launching a full-scale war between Lebanon through Hezbollah and Israel, which Israel, by the way, which if it happened, Israel would, by the way, destroy Beirut. I mean, destroy it, right?
Yep.
or does it, so I think frankly, Iran is kind of figuring its way, feeling its way through to see what's the best use of its forces.
Ambassador, unfortunately, we're going to have to just leave it there because of time, up against a time constraint. But really appreciate getting your time. Admiral Adam Airley, he's a principal at Ibero-American Consultants, giving us his perspective on the developing situation in Israel. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. Shares of SoFi are fluctuating right now. They're down about 1%. Now, the company increased its revenue forecast for 2023 after deposits more than tripled from a year earlier to $15.7 billion. We have more from Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld.
Not to mention, of course, more than 90% of those deposits are from direct deposit members, as the CEO called it, high-quality deposits. All told, SoFi added more than 700,000 new members in the quarter. That is a record. And, of course, the company also boosted its revenue forecast for 2023. So a lot to like there.
Now, SoFi has been traditionally known for its student loan refinancing business. And Greifeld says its CEO says that with repayments kicking back in, they should see a difference in the fourth quarter. Shares of Apple are higher. Right now, they're up about 1% before its big, scary, fast product event today. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow has a preview.
We're expecting a big focus on Mac, a new iMac according to Bloomberg's reporting, and an updated version of a high-end MacBook Pro. We also expect Apple to debut its latest generation silicon, the M3 chip, its PC processor, then move forward to Thursday when we get Apple earnings. The expectation is that overall we see a fourth consecutive quarter of sales decline.
Now, speaking of declines, new data shows Apple's iPhone 15 series saw a 6% drop in sales in China in its launch month compared with the prior year. Research points to Huawei Technologies as its Mate 60 series recorded sales of close to 1.5 million in its launch month, more than doubling from a year ago despite supply constraints. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom. In this Bloomberg Business Flash, 9 of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500 higher right now. Communication services in the lead, and the biggest drag coming from energy as oil falls over 3%. Some of the individual stock leaders include the tech giants. You have Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Alphabet. Equity still headed toward the third monthly slide, and this will be the longest losing streak since March of 2020, hurt by a surge in bond yields. You have the Treasury Department's new borrowing plan. That's out Wednesday, and the so-called quarterly refunding announcement. That's going to reveal the extent to which Treasury is going to ramp up sales of longer-term debt to fund a widening budget deficit. Right now, the S&P 500, 21 points higher. That's up 0.5%. We're at 4138 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, 280 points higher. And the NASDAQ 100 up 77 points. The 10-year yield, 5 basis points higher. That's at 488. According to Glassdoor, the website where you can review companies, discussions of layoffs reached the highest level since July of 2020 this month.
All right.
There's some angst out there, apparently, despite the fact that there's economic data that would indicate otherwise. Kind of a disconnect.
All the Sweeney offspring are gainfully employed. So you got that. I
You
feel like
tried
I've
to
done my
put
job.
shame
I've done my job.
with my
For now.
offspring.
No, they better keep it going. So
Well,
anyway.
they can always move to the Jersey Shore.
Oh
with you,
yeah,
right?
yeah. No thanks. John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate it. All right, I'm going to be honest with you, people. I am not looking forward to talking to our next guest here because our next guest wrote this. The last time the Federal Reserve raised its benchmark interest rate and held it there for a considerable period of time was in 2006 and 2007. That episode ended in calamity. This time may be different. After all, with the benefit of hindsight, policymakers can do better, but you can't count on that outcome. Ed Harrison joins us. He's a senior editor for Bloomberg News. He joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Ed, boy, I remember that time period really well, and it was scary for everybody. And I was a seasoned Wall Street veteran. I didn't know what was going to happen. Talk to us about the parallels you see maybe from today back to 2006, 2007.
Yeah, great setup there. I have to say that I do remember it well in terms of the housing bubble.
Yep.
But the thing that people don't really remember as well in retrospect is that everything looked pretty good by and large right up until the very end. And it was that holding interest rates at a high level over a considerable period of time that ended up hurting the economy. You know, Bernanke, he raised the interest rates up to a certain level, and then they stayed there for more than a year, and it was in that period of time that things started to fall apart. And so that's the thing to be worried about. We're not in that period yet. We're still in the hiking period. We're still getting to that level. But once we get there and stay there, that's when we have to be worried.
Of course, it's not just rates that are interesting right now. It's growth, right? 5.4% in Q3 was the Atlanta Now GDP forecast. We saw a reading the other day of 4.9%, so just huge. But how much of that is fueled by deficit spending? And how is that different than our situation in 2006? Because we're running now a $2 trillion deficit and pushing out total government debt to over $33 trillion.
Yeah, you know, I don't think that number, that $2 trillion number in the deficit from this past year is sustainable for the longer period of time. And so just from a pure growth trajectory perspective, it would suggest that in 2024, we're going to come down from those levels that you can't consume. The way that I was putting it in the piece that I wrote that you were flagging is that it's almost like the cash out mortgages people had. They had that little extra bit of money in their pockets as a result of the appreciation in their home values. We have that little bit extra of money in our pockets because of the transfer from the deficits. But once that goes away, then I think you will see people start to spend incrementally less money than they were before. And so then that growth number is going to come down.
All right. Any reason to believe our Federal Reserve has learned its lesson, internalized the lesson back from the great financial crisis, and maybe how it acts going forward?
Meaning what? By the way, meaning what, Paul? Because I sense that you think the Fed needs to start cutting rates, maybe in a preemptive fashion.
I think that I think they need to just hang for a little while. But yes, in 2024, I do believe a rate cut at some point next year. But do you think the Fed's kind of internalized what happened back in the day?
I think they have, like, on multiple levels. I mean, I'll give you 3 different points. One is in terms of 18-19, you know, when bad things happened in the leveraged loan and in the high yield market, that you saw that the Fed stopped their rate hikes at 2.5%. The second thing is the fact that when we saw bad things happen in March with Silicon Valley Bank, they came in there and they, in sort of almost a precise way, they created a liquidity provision just for that specific part of the economy without flooding the entire economy with money. And then the third thing I would say is that the Fed is much more focused now on making sure that the people who are the last on the employment ladder still have a chance to get in there. They don't want to go to the days where people get hired and then 3 months later they're the first to be let go. They want the cycle to last, and Jerome Powell's talked about that.
So, but I mean, if we're focused on growth, if we're focused on unemployment, are we still watching what's going on with inflation? Because that is the other part of the dual mandate that they've been talking about for 2 years, right? And promising us that they're going to get it back down to 2%. We're still more than 50% above that. So do they just give up on that?
No, and I think that's the tricky part. And that's the scary part in the sense that really if we're at 3-ish% now on almost all levels, there's no way, especially with unemployment where it is, which is below 4%, that they can do anything but hold. There's no way they can cut with inflation at those levels. Right. So that almost guarantees a repeat of the hike and hold for a long period of time that we saw that caused so much pain 15 years ago. So I think that it's very unlikely that we're going to get out of this cycle without something breaking. The question is what is it going to be and when is it going to happen, and what's their reaction going to be once that does happen?
So if we get, we say $2 trillion budget deficits are unsustainable, but who's going to change that, right? I mean, it doesn't look like we're going to have a much smaller deficit. I mean, maybe if it's $1 trillion, that's much smaller, but still too much, right? Are we going to see budget deficits continue to run at this level? And if we don't, the Fed has to cut in order to pad the economy.
Well, I would look at it in terms of what I would call the monetary offset. We know from the past when the fiscal policy is pumping money in, the Fed feels compelled to do something about it. And so everyone's talking about rate cuts in 2024. If we still have these deficits, adding spending, keeping the GDP growth high, we could be talking about rate hikes in 2024. Yikes. I think that is a potential that we actually get another rate hike, not in December, but in December and then again later, or even multiple rate hikes in 2024.
Ed, I'm trying to refinance the mortgage, my man. I need rates to come down a little bit. So work with me here. Labor market. I tell you what, I haven't understood this labor market really at all. I'm just so shocked that it remains so robust here. And some people tell me it's the hoarding of workers. I don't know what that means. I don't know how
is it really that robust, I think, is a question a lot of people are starting to ask. Yeah.
What do you think, Ed?
Yeah, I think that it's bifurcated in the sense that it isn't as robust as we think, right? Because when you look at continuing claims, they're very high and they remain high. But at the same time, when you ask businesses, how do you feel? They're like, we're not getting enough workers. There aren't enough workers out there. I think that when people talk about the skills mismatch, it really is there. So the people who are not getting employed are remaining on the unemployment rolls for considerably longer than we would like. But at the same time, there's still that dearth. I think it's because we're in the baby bust period. That's those people who were born after 64 coming into the prime. All of the baby boomers are leaving, and that's leaving us, with a shortage of workers. And as a result of that, it's putting upward pressure on wage gains, and that's helping bolster the economy in some ways.
I don't know. I'm still here. You think the Fed's going to make a mistake? And I don't know what a mistake is. Raising, I would think it would be a mistake. But do you think the Fed makes a mistake? Because I'm not sure what's going to break out there, like the housing market back in the day.
Well, the question is it a mistake for them to take the punch bowl away? Right. I mean, if you look at any chart of the S&P 500 over the last 15 years, it looks pretty astonishing.
Taking the punch bowl away in this sense would mean holding.
Right.
Wait, no. Taking the punch bowl away would mean raising. Holding is the punch bowl still there, which is crazy to think about because they've gone up 550 basis points in less than 2 years. But at the same time, the fiscal spend is just like a machine, right?
Yeah, I mean, you have these two forces going against one another. And so they're thinking, okay, once this machine starts to dwindle, then we can sort of passively tighten. They haven't said those words exactly, but if you listen to Lori
Bostic
Logan,
has pretty much said that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
We're passively tightening because real interest rates are going up.
Yep.
And moreover, when you have all of this money being pumped out in terms of deficit spending, that means that you, as a result, need more higher rates to absorb all of that.
All right. That wasn't so bad. Ed Harrison, thanks so much for joining us. Ed Harrison's the senior editor, Bloomberg News. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. Amy Morris has got world and national news for us.
Thank you, Paul. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warning of a long and difficult war against Hamas as the conflict enters what he calls the second phase. We talked with Elliot Ackerman, a former White House fellow and Marine veteran, about what happens if Israel is successful in extinguishing Hamas.
I think the question is now, what do you do in Gaza? And do you face a protracted insurgency in Gaza? And I think when it comes to this idea of normalizing relations in the region, that's when we start to get into questions of diplomacy.
Former White House fellow Elliot Ackerman says it is important to look at the politics behind the war, including those talks of a peace deal between Saudis and Israelis. The relationship between FTX and Alameda Research is under a microscope as the trial of Sam Bankman-Fried continues. Bankman-Fried returns to the stand today and will likely face a bruising cross-examination from prosecutors after Friday's testimony where he admitted to mistakes but said he did not commit fraud. Sources tell Bloomberg General Motors says it has reached a tentative agreement with the United Auto Workers to end a 6-week-old strike with similar terms to the deal signed by Ford on October 25th. We talked with Bloomberg Detroit Bureau Chief David Welch, who says there is still more work ahead.
These contracts do actually take some time to kind of get ratified and that sort of thing. And there will be this sort of almost Byzantine process where they go about, trying to get everything ratified.
Sources say the deal includes a 25% hourly pay raise plus a cost of living allowance over the more than 4-year contract. UAW had targeted 8 assembly plants and 38 parts distribution facilities from the 3 automakers since the strike began September 15th. It expanded the strike with a walkout last week at GM's Spring Hill, Tennessee plant. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
Profits. Headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. The S&P 500 bouncing back from oversold levels. You recall, after last week's decline, it entered into a correction. As far as earnings, McDonald's sales and profits beat expectations in the third quarter. You can thank higher prices for that. Shares up about 1.9%. And, halfway through the earnings season, 79% of those companies that have reported they delivered positive earnings surprises. As far as treasuries, the benchmark 10-year yield rising 6 basis points. We're at 488. This week will bring with it a treasury refunding, and the demand's going to be closely watched to see if investors' appetite is going to hold up. Well, the path ahead for stocks will depend a lot on those bond yields. That's according to Max Kentner at HSBC Bank.
To me, it's really about bond market volatility to subside, right? A bit more certainty, a bit more stability. That already could actually be sufficient for multiples to expand and ultimately then for equities to rally as well.
Right now, the Dow up 312 points, S&P 500 24 points higher. That's up 0.6. The NASDAQ 100 81 points higher. That is up 0.6%. Then you have crude oil, NYMEX crude, West Texas, down over 3%, down 3.4% at 82.62 a barrel. Harris poll for Bloomberg News has found that more middle-class Americans are worried about the state of the economy than a year ago. 57% of middle-class respondents, I don't even know what makes up the middle class anymore, said higher borrowing costs were having a negative impact on their household finances.
I think you're middle-aged and middle class.
I think middle class is if you earn between $40,000 and $2 million a year.
That's a broad swath.
Exactly.
The Onion, which is one of my favorite news sources, had a special on the Museum of the Middle Class. Like people sitting around a couch watching TV.
Yep.
These wax figurines. Yes, son, that used to be the middle class.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Also streaming live on YouTube, so head over there and search Bloomberg Radio. All right, it is October 30th. For most people, that means they are into their holiday shopping mode. Mine kicks in around December 20th when I'll start clicking some buttons, hoping for that instant delivery, but a lot of folks are into it. The question is, what's this season going to be like for the retailers? Shannon Siri joins us. She's an economist at Wells Fargo. They've done some work on this. Shannon, thanks so much for taking the time to join us here via that Zoom thing. I don't know. I don't know. The back to school sounded like it was okay for retailers. What does your work suggest about this coming holiday season?
Yeah, so I'm with you, where I do most of mine right before I'm one of those last minute shoppers. But basically, when we look at the projections here in terms of where the holidays are going to shake up compared to last year or the year before, we're looking for a pretty decent holiday season. So in typical times, this is above average pace of growth, somewhere about a 5% annual pace in the months of November and December. But compared to the last 3 years coming out of the pandemic, it's going to be a bit of a step down. So decent for retailers, but likely somewhat of a slowdown from what we've experienced in recent pandemic-driven years.
I wonder, I saw Mattel earnings and was surprised that Barbie only grew 10%, not even, in the past quarter. Do you think that the consumer is now getting stuck with too much credit card debt, too high car payments, the resumption of student loans, and is going to have a tough time? Or do you think that we'll, as we always seem to do in the last minute, find it in our hearts to take on more debt and buy more stuff?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag this holiday season, but as we transition into next year, I do think a lot of those factors are going to come to the fore in terms of how households are going to be able to continue to spend. So I think we're in pretty decent shape for the final quarter, just given kind of the momentum and resiliency we've seen so far to date. We obviously got third quarter GDP data last week, which showed a pretty resilient consumer. But we are growing increasingly worried about households' ability to continue to spend. So you mentioned high credit card debt, excess liquidity starting starting to dwindle, student loan payments resuming, all of those factors are headwinds for consumers. Most notably for us, however, we do think it continues to hinge on the state of the labor market. So until households become worried about their job position or their job prospects, until they start to see wage growth moderate more significantly, we think they're going to continue to spend. So I really think it's up to the labor market at this point, given some of those other headwinds are already starting to materialize, and spending has remained pretty resilient so far.
All right, so for whatever dollars are in consumers' pockets, I guess the decision is still, experiences versus goods. I'm clearly in the experiences camp. Where are we in that? Because coming out of the pandemic,
I like goods.
You like goods?
Yeah.
See, I'm staging my life. I'm getting rid of things.
You go away for a week, give me a watch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. So where are we there, Shannon?
Yeah, so I mean, for the holidays, we're still seeing a pretty decent outturn in terms of goods spending. So our forecast is primarily goods or gifts consumption. But I do think that experience-driven spending is kind of taking up more and more wallet share, particularly still coming out of the pandemic where there's some pent-up demand there, and then also just the transition over time to more of an experience-based spending or consumer basket. So I think both are factors here. Obviously, there's different demographics and other structural changes that shape that outlook. But for the holidays, when we're primarily talking about holiday sales, we're mostly talking about gift spending. So we do think retailers will see a decent amount of consumption, primarily on that goods side, though restaurants and leisure spend, I think, can take up more wallet share this year compared to years past.
How do things like the supply chain and logistics chain look to you right now?
Good one.
Much better than they did. They're continuing to improve, and I think when I think about how that impacts the holiday outlook, I mean, retailers are in better shape in terms of their inventory levels, so maybe not as much discounting as the past few years, or excuse me, maybe more discounting than the last few years where they didn't have as much inventory on hand. So it is a factor that I think could show up in terms of the retail outlook, but I think supply chains are in a much better shape, and we're also seeing that show up in terms of the inflation metrics as well.
And one of the things that, the pandemic did in the retail space, it just accelerated that shift from, buying in-store to buying online by, a lot of folks said 3, 4, 5 years. Are we still seeing share shift from, physical goods to, shopping online?
Definitely. So your online sales is still the largest component of holiday sales. So we measure it by retail sales data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and non-store retailers is the biggest component of holiday sales. It's been rising over time, and we expect it to kind of maintain that lion's share of overall holiday sales. But I think, coming back to the beginning of our conversation, if you're that last minute consumer, going to the mall, going to the store might be a bit easier than finding something online that's able to get there before the holidays. Obviously, some of these major corporations have invested in that last mile delivery, but I don't think it's yet at a point where it's outpacing that last minute consumer in terms of being able to still go to the store. So it's definitely growing and something we think is going to maintain its upward trajectory. But I think your in-store big box retailers are also going to have a decent holiday sales season this year.
All right, Shannon, thanks so much for joining us there. Shannon Siri, she is an economist at Wells Fargo. What's on top of the Edna list?
Well,
are we getting Barbie for Edna?
Edna has just had her birthday, right? She just turned 3 last week. So I realized that she has now far too many toys, and she gets way too many presents. I'm honestly worried that it's going to spoil her as a human.
Right.
So I'm going to dial it down a little bit in terms of the gift giving. But in terms of the Miller family, for many years, we would push Christmas back a day so that you could go and do your shopping on December 26th.
Really?
Yeah, because you get massive discounts, right? And then we all realized, why are we even doing this at all? So now we've just no more gift giving.
Really?
In the extended Miller family.
Extended Miller family.
Yeah.
Now, is this wow, so your brother's
Because to me, a much better gift to get from you than a tie that I'm not going to wear is the acceptance of me not buying you something. You know what I'm saying?
Yep. So what happens with the in-laws now? Do you extend this to the in-laws? If you go to Spain without a gift,
my in-laws are from Spain, so they don't really do like American style
consumerism.
They're not putting themselves into deep debt in order to buy each other, a lot of stuff. they'll get you like a $10 hand cream. That's like a gift in Spain, right?
That's a gift in Spain. All right, very good. Now we know more than we probably needed to know about the gift giving in the Miller household. I think it's kind of bah humbug, but you got to give something, I would think. S&P 500 up 0.6%. The Nasdaq up 0.75%. The stock market having a nice day today. We're gonna have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
You got to do the grab bag, Matt. That's what you do. It makes it cheaper. I'm telling. That's what my family does. Good morning, guys. United Auto Workers have reached a tentative agreement with General Motors. Now it includes a 25% hourly pay raise plus cost of living allowances over the more than 4-year contract. The UAW has already reached tentative deals with Ford and Stellantis. Bloomberg Auto reporter Gabrielle Coppola explains the differences between each company and how that affected negotiations.
GM has much bigger pool of retirees than, say, Stellantis does. But Stellantis has fewer plants in the U.S. Than Ford and GM. Ford has the most. And the temp worker issue, that was an interesting one because Ford has always kind of been the Boy Scout here of the D3. Like, they always like to brag that they have more American workers and full-time workers than their counterparts, and that's true. So it was kind of less painful for them to bring up the temps than it would have been for GM and Stellantis.
GM Stellantis right now down a fraction. Ford is down about 2%. McDonald's posted sales and profits that beat expectations in the third quarter, despite pricier burgers. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle says there's mixed messages.
They're talking about expecting to see the tough macro to continue, inflationary pressures, but they're also talking about the idea that consumers are still accepting price increases, but they're saying that they are benefiting from a trade down from pricier options. So if I'm reading this correctly, it sounds as though some consumers are willing to pay up and that the ones that are not are trading down, and it is benefiting McDonald's.
Shares up about 2%. And shares of Krispy Kreme are fluctuating. They're down a fraction after Truist Securities downgraded shares and cut price targets due to the boom in weight loss drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Matt Miller and Paul Sweeney live here on our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, looking at these markets here. The S&P 500 up 0.75%, solid day there. NASDAQ up about 0.9%. Yields also moving a little bit higher here. Your 10-year treasuries, but about 6 basis points, 4.89%. WTI crude oil off sharply, off 3.5% here to $82.50 a barrel, so a big move there. Bitcoin slightly higher, 34,654 Bitcoin. I'll call that out for Tom Keene. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Amy Mars.
Thank you, Paul. The new Speaker of the House says a standalone funding bill for Israel will go on the House floor this week. Louisiana Republican Mike Johnson told Fox News it has bipartisan support.
There are lots of things going on around the world that we have to address, and we will. But right now, what's happening in Israel takes the immediate attention, and I think we've got to separate that and get it through.
The Biden administration is proposing a combined $100 billion aid package, including both Israel and Ukraine. President Biden is expected to sign a sweeping artificial intelligence executive order today. The order tackles Bloomberg government got a copy of the order, which tackles a broad array of issues, placing new safety obligations on AI developers, calling on federal agencies to mitigate the technology's risks while evaluating their own use of the tool. A senior official says the rule will likely only apply to future systems and not those that are already on the market. Donald Trump will be spending a big part of his week in Texas, attending fundraisers. Experts say he's using the Lone Star State like a piggy bank.
Texas has been fertile ground for conservative fundraisers all the way since Lyndon Johnson, because Texas has a lot of wealth, and that's conservative wealth mostly.
SMU political analyst Cal Jilson says the GOP frontrunner has a long, strong political and fundraising operation in Texas. He'll be in Dallas on Wednesday and then Houston on Thursday, and both events are private. There are no public rallies planned. It may be weeks until the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner releases an official cause of death for Friends star Matthew Perry. Officials confirm an autopsy was completed yesterday. There were no obvious signs of trauma nor foul play. Perry was 54 years old. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Matt and Paul.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Matt, you wear a Rolex, correct?
I do have, yes.
Amongst your many.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not many, but I have.
I wear an Omega. So it is very competitive between Rolex and Omega, apparently, and it even goes to real estate. A Rolex subsidiary bought a building which houses rival Omega's flagship boutique on Geneva's priciest shopping street in the latest battle between top Swiss watch brands for prime real estate. So the real estate deal underscores the intense competition between brands for both customers and the best located stores. I didn't think that was a thing, but Omega now will be writing a sizable rent check to its biggest competitor each month, and Rolex will have a say in how the building is maintained and operates. Under certain conditions, a new owner can more easily terminate an existing lease. So it could get ugly there as these watch brands go back and forth, not just for customers, but for the best stores on the best street.
Yeah, and don't forget that Rolex just bought the retailer Bucher and its 100 global boutique. So Rolex really making moves in this area. I actually woke up this morning to a brand new Omega on the internet, not on my wrist, unfortunately. They have a new Seamaster Planet Ocean.
Oh, yeah?
A gray ceramic edition that I think is absolutely awesome.
It's a good-looking timepiece.
It's a little bit too big for my wrist. I think it's 45.4 millimeters in diameter, and it's 17.5 millimeters tall. So I think it's going to be a big piece, but not heavy, because the internals are made with titanium, and then the housing is this new ceramic composite that they have. So very cool watch.
It's amazing. I got my watch on, I think, the Omega store here in New York on 5th Avenue, I think it is. Boy, when you send that thing back to get repaired or just serviced, they send it back to Switzerland. Like, we don't have watch people here in New York. They send it back, and they keep it for like months. So I have no idea what's going on there. But anyway, I enjoyed my Omega watch. And Omega, Rolex, competing not just for customers, but also for prime real estate. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to check in with our friend Bobby Ghosh. He's a columnist with Bloomberg Opinion. Want to get his thoughts on what Israel's calling its second phase of its war with Hamas. And then we're going to do a nice big block round table on the latest on the political front. Kaylee Lyons, host of Bloomberg Sound On and Bloomberg Crypto, is going to join us from D.C., as well as Amy Lee Copeland, partner at the law firm Rouse & Copeland, located in Georgia. We're going to talk about all the political issues with Nikki Haley and Mr. Pence dropping out. Mr. President Trump has some issues down in Georgia on the legal front, so we're going to bring it all together there. But first, let's go to Charlie Pellet for a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hi, thank you very much. We're looking at an up Monday here with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ very much in the green. Stocks higher. Oil down 3.5%. Treasuries slid as Israel's ground incursion into Gaza appeared less extensive than investors had feared. S&P 500 halting a slide that drove the gauge to oversold levels. Right now, the S&P is up 33 points, higher by 0.8%. The S&P back at 4150. The Dow up 365 points now. That is a gain of 1.1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 119 points, higher by about 0.9%. 10-year yield 4.89% with a 2-year 5.04%. Spot gold down $7 the ounce to $19.99, decline there of 0.4%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 3.6%, $82.45 for a barrel of WTI. Stephen Dover is chief market strategist at Franklin Templeton Group, and this morning on Surveillance he told us this is not a bad time to be cautious.
Generally, what we are advising clients to do is clients tend to be overweight cash right now. We think interest rates are near peaking and going down, so it makes some sense to move into fixed income.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Bottom line here, equities still on track for their third monthly slump, the longest since March of 2020. Sources tell Bloomberg GM has reached a tentative contract agreement with the UAW, as we have been reporting. GM shares, little change right now at $27.23. They're up just about 1 cent. We've got Ford down 1.7%. And also among some of the automakers today, looking at Stellantis shares, they're down by 0.2%. So again, recapping, stocks pushing higher. S&P up 33, gain there of 0.8%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're also streaming live on YouTube, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. As Charlie was just reporting, nice day in the equity markets with the S&P up 0.8%. Bailey Lipschultz joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Bailey, what are you looking at in those markets today?
Yeah, big divide within technology. NASDAQ 100 up 0.9%. The semiconductor index, the SOX, down 1.5%. Matt Miller would call that bifurcation. Looking at the weakness being driven by onsemi, ticker ON.
What a dichotomy.
What's your other favorite surveillance word?
Well, no, bifurcation is definitely my favorite surveillance word.
I thought there was one more, something related to percent. I don't remember. Anyway, onsemi down, weighing on chip makers, down 20%, biggest intraday drop since March 2020. That's weighing on stocks like NXP Semi, ticker NXPI, Microchip Technology down 3.8%. Rambus underperforming, so weakness for chip makers and semiconductors, or chip makers are semiconductors. One of the stocks that had been closely watched, SoFi Technologies, ticker SOFI, had its biggest surge in 3 months, now actually down 1.2%, so giving back some of those gains.
Well, because Anthony Noto's on Bloomberg Television right now, the CEO, so maybe he's saying something.
So see, looking at the lower third, we're executing across the board. The big thing for this is a company that wanted to kind of rebrand itself away from just being a place for wealthier millennials to refinance their student debt to be kind of a one-stop shop. They did buy a bank, so they had been seeing a large jump in the amount of people using direct deposit to kind of earn a bigger yield on their savings accounts, but it does seem like that stock has given back the bulk of those gains. Other stock that actually has held on to gains, Meta Platforms, ticker META, right now up 2.5%, all on that push for the ad-free subscriptions for Instagram and Facebook in Europe.
When's Apple report? That's Thursday after the close, or
Thursday, I believe so.
Okay.
Dude, all you have to do is AAPL Equity DES, and you can see that they report on, Thursday.
But the event is tonight, or actually in like an hour, right?
Yes.
Hour, 1 o'clock?
Right, and we're going to talk to Mark Gurman, Bloomberg News. He's kind of our breaks.
Well, it's a movable feast.
It's a what?
This is a surveillance phrase. This is a Tom Keenism. It's like every day I ask myself, what is a movable feast? I think, I've been listening to surveillance ever since Tom started it with Ken Pruitt here on Bloomberg Radio, and I must have Googled movable feast like 100 times in that. I mean, I don't get it.
Tom Keene has his own lexicon.
But it keeps you coming back, doesn't it?
It keeps coming back. McDonald's?
Speaking of,
beating expectations, up 2.3%. The interesting thing, Paul, that you mentioned, we are seeing a growth in pretty strong in terms of comparable sales. The one thing that they did call out, though, is industry-wide, they're seeing low-income consumers making $45,000 and under, obviously negatively impacted from an industry standpoint, because this is a company among the many raising prices. So obviously, if you make the Happy Meal or your number one from McDonald's more expensive, your lower income consumer probably shying away, but still up 2.3% on those earnings. Another outperformer, XPO, ticker XPO, in the trucking and logistics space, up 14%, beating expectations for third quarter and talking up kind of where the demand, they're seeing demand core North Americans less than truckload business beating expectations. That's according to BMO. So another area that we're seeing strength in what is an overall green day.
Yeah, I like that XPO story, especially because it gives you a great sense of where the economy is, because they touch pretty much all of that, transportation supply chain, and they see where rates are going and everything like that. So it's always a good harbinger from my perspective. Pretty cool company. All right, Bailey, thanks so much for joining us. Bailey Lipschitz, he covers all the markets for Bloomberg News. Let's welcome in Bobby Ghosh. He's a columnist with Bloomberg Opinion. He joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. So, Bobby, I guess the news over the weekend from the Middle East is Israel is starting, I guess, what they're calling kind of their next phase here, going in, I guess, on a limited basis into Gaza. What's your takeaway from what we kind of learned over the weekend and today?
Well, the long wait seems finally to be over. We've been waiting for this ground invasion. I think the way most people had imagined it would happen is not the way that it's actually playing out. It's playing out in drips and drabs, phase by phase, rather than one huge sort of military operation. This puts the President Biden, in an awkward position because he's been trying to restrain Israel from doing this. He's been trying to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza to the Palestinians, and I don't think it's a coincidence that even as this military operation has begun, Israel is saying that it's going to allow more aid to go in. So it's trying to balance both its own security decisions and the pressure coming from the American side. It doesn't want to be seen, I don't think. Israel doesn't want to be seen as blowing off the President of the United States, their most important ally at this moment. So they are allowing in some humanitarian aid, but they also have their own time, their own calendar for when this military operation takes place. It has its own logic, and I think that's what we're seeing playing out right now.
By the way, don't we have a seat at the table? I mean, regardless, we do wire them $3.8 billion every single year. And now Mike Johnson has put a bill on the floor to give them an additional $14.5 billion. And this isn't a poor economy, right? This is a country that does well. Yeah. So I know that part of the idea is we're subsidizing our own weapons industry, but we send them a lot of money. We pay for a lot of this.
we do have a seat at the table. That is why they've held out until now. I think they would have gone much sooner. I think they probably wouldn't have allowed humanitarian aid, certainly not to the scale that we're seeing now, if it wasn't for President Biden. But again, you know, if you're Bibi Netanyahu, you're balancing two different things. You've got pressure from the United States, important ally, big supplier of aid, big supplier of military hardware, as well as diplomatic cover. So that's pressure on that side. On the other hand, you have Israelis who are still traumatized by the events of 3 weeks ago and want to see vengeance done and want to see this threat of Hamas removed forever. We can debate whether this is the right way to do it, but those are the two competing pressures that Bibi Netanyahu has to deal with. Something's got to give.
I imagine there are also a lot of Israelis who are still, you know, shocked and horrified by what happened on October 7th, but are in favor of giving some sort of humanitarian aid to the people in Gaza. I mean, you can't see these pictures of little children, you know, among ruined buildings or in hospitals covered in blood and not feel for, you know, their innocence.
Oh yeah, I'm sure there are lots of Israelis who feel that way right now, and that's Israeli society writ large. It's always been like this. You've always had a very large proportion of that society that is liberal, that is that wants to live in peace with the Palestinians, and it's also true on the other side of this divide. And then there are people on both sides who don't want to live with each other, who don't believe in a two-state solution, and want to see only one state, one ethnic.
By the way, is
state.
Netanyahu among those in the latter camp? He doesn't.
I think so. Yes.
He doesn't want to see his two-state solution.
No,
He's been
his actions
into
over
the West Bank. Yeah,
his actions over a 20-year period during which he has been mostly prime minister. His actions suggest he has no interest in a two-state solution. Quite the contrary. And of course, his political alliance, the governing alliance, is full of hard people who are farther to the right of him, and who have, many of them on the record, have said that they don't see the two-state solution as anything they want to see in their future. They would like the Palestinian people simply to disappear.
You know, it's some of my earliest memories as a child was my father and my oldest brother arguing at the dinner table over Vietnam. And my daughter, who's 27, we've had over the past couple, 3 weeks, our most, I would say, challenging discussions that we've ever had. And it's really polarized the world, it seems like. And the pro-Iranian, the pro-Israeli, the anti-Palestine, or vice versa, really raging all over the world. Are you surprised that there's this much pushback, maybe even in this country, against Israel?
I'm surprised by the ferocity of it and some of the sort of more extreme aspect of it, the fact that there are people who are sympathetic to the Palestinians, as indeed they have every right to be, but there is a smaller subset of that cohort of people who are celebrating Hamas's success, what they regard as a success on the 7th of October. They are a fringe element. It's important for us to say that. But I'm surprised that they are out in the open and feel comfortable saying the things that they're saying.
Yeah, shocking.
That is really quite shocking. On the Israeli side, in Israel, we see Israeli ministers and senior government figures going on national television and saying there are no innocents in Gaza. All 2.5 million people there are all to be regarded as Hamas.
Equally shocking.
So the venom that we are seeing being unleashed is really. I cover conflict. I have covered conflict for a living for much of the past 30 years. I've not seen that kind of venom in this country. I'm thinking of previous instances of major terrorist attacks. I think by and large, people have been united behind the notion that terrorism is a bad thing. Killing babies is a bad thing, no matter who does it. But now there seems to be, at least among the fringes of public opinion, there are people on both sides who think killing babies may not be such a bad thing, and that is really shocking to me.
Well, I mean, it's even here in New York City where we like to think we're tolerant of all different, peoples from around the world because everybody's here. We're all kind of pushed together on this small island.
It's a melting pot.
It's a melting pot.
Multicultural.
You have a column talking about it from the perspective of a restaurant owner. Talk to us about your recent column.
I just came back from shooting a video there. So this is a Palestinian restaurant. It's been around here for a few years.
It's not Middle Eastern. It's
Palestinian.
Right.
Husband and wife are both Americans. He's Egyptian Americans, she's Palestinian Americans, both born and raised in Brooklyn. Terrific food. I highly recommend it. I've written about the food before. But since the 7th of October, they suddenly started getting these negative reviews. Until now, rave reviews, 4 stars, 5 stars. Suddenly, hundreds upon hundreds of 1-star reviews appear on their Google sort of page. And if you look at who's doing these reviews, it's very clear it's people who are not even in New York, never mind people who never went to that restaurant. And so this is a targeted attack at a small business. And it comes at a particularly bad time for this poor couple because they're launching 2 new restaurants. They just had their first baby, and they're having to deal with this. They're sort of, if you like, a kind of, in a way, a collateral damage of something that's taking place far away in the world. Now, they have their views. They're, as I said, she's a Palestinian American. She has their views about what she regards as the occupation of her ancestral home, but they are peaceful. They, in the language that they use in the restaurant, I've seen their menu. It calls for peace. It calls for coexistence.
It's crazy.
And it's astonishing that they should have to deal with this.
By the way, Bobby, we say in all of our stories, and many other media outlets say, Hamas, designated a terrorist organization by the United States and the EU, because we want to qualify that as journalists. Although I don't see how you could interpret what Hamas did on October 7th in any other way.
Well, people do, unfortunately. The president of Turkey goes on a massive rally and openly says that Hamas is a resistance group. It's a group
he said
of
they're
freedom
not
fighters.
terrorists, which I don't understand how that. You look what happened on October 7th, and that was certainly terrorism. You just said what they regard as occupation in Palestine. Is there any debate over the Israeli occupation of Palestine? I mean, they have sent settlers into the West Bank for decades, and they have checkpoints inside of Gaza. The IDF does. So is that not a factual occupation?
There is debate even within Israeli society, even amongst Israelis themselves. There are many who acknowledge that this is an occupation. There are Israeli there's the human rights groups that openly call it that. They use even harsher language. They use the A word. They call it. They acknowledge that their own state is conducting apartheid. In this country, there is a tendency, particularly in the political elite in the United States, to sort of pussyfoot around it, if you like, because there are sensitivities. Call it one of the third rails of American politics, that people sort of try to avoid that kind of language. But my attitude towards this is that if the Israelis are having this debate, then it behooves us to do so as well.
Just an amazing story, evolving story. We're fortunate to get some perspective from Bobby Ghosh. Bobby Ghosh is a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, joining us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Again, it seems like a new phase of the danger and of the conflict over there in Israel and in Gaza, so we will obviously stay on top of that. Looking at the markets here, just getting a quick market check. S&P 500 up about 0.8%. NASDAQ up about 0.9%. Yields also higher. 10-year Treasury up 6 basis points. Yielding 4.89%. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
You had to call a setback for the world's most valuable company and its most important overseas market. New data shows Apple's iPhone 15 series saw a 6% decline in sales in China in its launch month compared with the prior year. Now, research points to Huawei Technology's return to the mobile market. Its Mate 60 series, well, that recorded sales of close to 1.5 million in its launch month, more than doubling from a year ago, despite supply constraints. But the news isn't stopping the excitement over Apple's Scary Fast product event today. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow has a preview.
We're expecting a big focus on Mac, a new iMac according to Bloomberg's reporting, and an updated version of a high-end MacBook Pro. We also expect Apple to debut its latest generation silicon, the M3 chip, its PC processor, then move forward to Thursday when we get Apple earnings. The expectation is that overall we see a 4th consecutive quarter of sales decline.
Shares right now up about 0.8%. New subscription tiers have rolled out at Elon Musk's X. Subscribers at the social media platform formerly known as Twitter now have the option of paying $3 a month for the basic tier, while web users can choose to pay $8 a month for the premium tier or $16 a month for Premium Plus to get those additional benefits. And meanwhile, Meta Platforms, well, they're set to offer users in Europe ad-free access to Facebook and Instagram for a fee starting in November. Users who want the option will pay just over $10 a month on the web and slightly more on mobile operating systems. Right now, Meta shares are up about 2%. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg, with the S&P 500 halting a slide that drove the gauge to oversold levels. Right now, the S&P is up 28, back at 41.45, a gain now of 0.7%. The Dow's up 342 points, up 1.1%, while the Nasdaq Composite Index is up 94. That is a gain of 0.8%. Spot gold, $19.98 the ounce, down 0.4%, while West Texas Intermediate crude down 3.2%, $82.82 right now for a barrel of WTI. McDonald's shares up 2.3%. McDonald's sales and profit beat expectations in the third quarter thanks to higher prices. The burger chain said comparable sales, which track restaurants open at least 13 months, rose 8.8% in the period, surpassing the 7.8% average estimate of analysts polled by Bloomberg. Again, McDonald's shares are advancing. McDonald's are now up by 2.3%. Recapping, stocks are higher. The S&P up 28, up 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney live here in a Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio, streaming live on YouTube, so you can check that out, youtube.com. All right, let's do a big roundtable here on politics. We've got an election coming up. Kaylee Lines joins us. She's host of Bloomberg Sound On and Bloomberg's Crypto. And we also are joined today by Amy Lee Copeland. She is a partner at Rouse & Copeland. That's a law firm based in Georgia. So we want to check in with both of these folks. Kaylee, let's start with you on the Republican front. Lots of movement there in the list of potential nominees here. Mike Pence dropping out, Nikki Haley rising in the polls. What's the feeling in D.C. these days?
Well, at least the field poll is narrowing. We've had a number of candidates competing for the Republican nomination, and slowly we've started to see them trickling out of the race as it becomes abundantly clear that Donald Trump is still far and away the front runner. That said, there are some people on the upswing. Mike Pence is now out. He has not actually endorsed any one of the remaining candidates yet, so we'll see if he throws his support behind someone else. Of course, his former boss in Iowa, which is really where a lot of these races are now focusing, is still leading by dozens of points at 43%. But Nikki Haley at 16%, which now ties her with Ron DeSantis. He actually has moved from 19% in Iowa in August down to 16, whereas she's jumped from about 6% in the polls up to 16. So she's really one that is ascendant right now.
Exactly. Well, as it relates to former President Donald Trump, obviously one of the big issues for his candidacy would be his legal challenges, particularly, well, there's one big one down in Georgia. Amy Lee Copeland, thanks so much for joining us. Talk to us about what's the lay of the land down in Georgia these days for the former president and his legal woes there.
Hey, good afternoon. Well, right now, 19 defendants have been indicted in this massive Georgia RICO indictment. 4 people have entered pleas of guilty, including 3 of Trump's legal advisors and a bail bondsman with connection to the Trump campaign. The DA's office has approached 6 other defendants to try to solicit pleas or to at least engage in plea negotiations without any success. And they have confirmed to CNN, at least, that Trump and Giuliani and Eastman and Meadows have not been offered pleas. So the case continues to go along with the documentary evidence and now the attorneys who are pleading guilty and agreeing to testify truthfully, or in Jenna Ellis's case, cooperate fully against the former president.
So, Amy Lee, what's the worst case scenario for Donald Trump?
Well, the worst case scenario is that he goes to trial and gets convicted. There are documents that the DA has encountered. You remember, there was not just a grand jury in this case, but a special purpose grand jury that investigated for over a year. It heard testimony from 75 witnesses, including election deniers. And this special purpose grand jury issued recommendations that people be indicted, and a regular grand jury did indict. So the case is moving along. It should go to trial probably after the January 6th trial in D.C., and that looks like it might be even in summer of 2024.
I'm just wondering because, you know, we have an election denier now as Speaker of the House, and that after January 6th. So, and then if Donald Trump becomes the U.S. president, he would, I guess, have the power to pardon himself, right? So,
but not in Georgia. Not in Georgia.
I see, not for state. Interesting.
Not for state conviction, yeah.
So, but it's not imaginable that he would be jailed in Georgia and elected U.S. president and not be, you know, let out to go to Washington, D.C., right?
I don't know. Kaylee, we kind of talk about this, Kaylee, but let's be honest, the polls are telling you that his voters don't care. How does a party kind of deal with all his legal challenges here?
Well, they're still contending with it, Paul. But to your point, his base of support, that core base of Trump voters, always Trump voters, don't seem to have been rattled at all by each and every case that is brought against him, both civil and criminal. In fact, it really only seems to cement it as he kind of tries to frame this as a narrative in which the Justice Department is being weaponized against him. You look at the gag order that was just reinstated here in Washington in the case that Judge Chutkan is presiding over. That's the Jack Smith election interference case that was brought here in Washington, D.C., the federal one. That gag order reinstated as his team tries to appeal it. And he said that's another example of the Biden administration being weaponized against him, even though this is a separate branch of government that we're talking about here. But it's that narrative that this persecution of a political opponent is what Trump is experiencing right now, seems to make those people who are supportive of him even more so. And that's something that the other Republican contenders for the nomination are having to wrestle with. How do you avoid alienating that base of support while also trying to go on the attack against a frontrunner? It's very difficult, as we've seen proven time and again.
Amy, if President Trump were your client, what would you advise him at this point? Is a plea deal even possible? Is it just, what would you say to him?
Well, what I would say to him and the advice that he takes seems to be dramatically different if you read about his other legal travails in the news. Right now, I suspect that he is going to go to trial. I cannot imagine that this former president would come forward and enter a guilty plea or even seek a guilty plea. And Steve Sadow, his attorney, has basically said as much, that the Trump position is that these witnesses are actually going to help him and that it's not going to be a problem for him. I fully anticipate that he will go to trial. I suspect, though, that they are relying on a principle called jury nullification, that one person is just going to hold out and say there's no way we're going to convict the former president, which would launch the case into a mistrial and the DA could try it again or not.
It's fascinating and unprecedented, right? We've never dealt with anything like this. What's the chances, Amy Lee, that that this ends up going to the Supreme Court?
Well, to get to the Supreme Court, it would first have to go through the Georgia Court of Appeals, the Georgia Supreme Court, and then the U.S. Supreme Court can only hear it if the Georgia Supreme Court. Yeah, it could take a minute.
So, Kaylee, what's the what's the feeling in Washington D.C., the Republican National Committee? I mean, it just seems like the Trump campaign, the Trump presence, the Trump positioning with the voters is so strong that he is the presumptive front runner now. Is that kind of the feeling?
It is. It feels not necessarily like a solidified inevitability, but at the moment, it seems highly likely that Trump would be the Republican nominee, barring something really unforeseen happening. That is kind of the feeling, and then it becomes one of general election politics, because just because the former president can lead in the Republican primary and win primary elections, that doesn't necessarily translate to come November 2024 in the general election. That said, we have started to see the gap between Trump and Biden closing. I believe the Real Clear Politics average of polling, if it's a Trump and Biden rematch in 2024, which, by the way, polling indicates voters do not want to happen. But if that happens, they're effectively tied within the margin of error. So it would be a very close one.
Amy, as you look at all of the legal issues that the former President Trump is dealing with, which ones would present the most peril, do you think?
Well, I think they all do. I think probably the easiest one is for the government to prove is the classified documents case. That seems like a real red light, green light sort of issue. Georgia, though, cannot be underestimated in the peril it poses to the former president. With the attorney advisors who've already pleaded guilty, they have admitted that some statements were false. Statements like the false electors were the duly certified and elected electors of the state of Georgia. Jenna Ellis's guilty plea admits that it was false that dead people in Georgia voted or that felons voted. And some of those claims were the ones that Mr. Trump repeated in his call to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find 11,780 votes. Even with other pleas, with Ms. Powell's plea too, with the voting machines, that those were breached and that voter data was taken. So everything presents a unique peril to the former president. But I think probably the classified documents would be the easiest for the government to prove, followed shortly and closely by the Georgia case.
All right. Amy Lee Copeland, thank you so much for joining us. Amy Lee Copeland, she's a partner at Rouse and Copeland in Georgia, and she is all in the state of Georgia. Undergraduate degree from the University of Georgia, and then a law degree from the University of Georgia as well. So all in there on the Georgia. And Kaylee Lyons, host of Bloomberg Sound On and Bloomberg's Crypto, just giving us a little sense of the lay of the land. Boy, the next 12 plus months are going to be absolutely crazy from a political perspective. Not only do you have a presidential election, but you've got a former president who presumably be running, for the Republican side, facing a rash of legal challenges.
It's not just unusual, but again, unprecedented.
Unprecedented.
By the way, Kaylee's show with Joe Matthew begins at 2 p.m., her portion of it, every day on Bloomberg Radio. I listen on Sirius XM, channel 119. No, Joe's show begins at 1 p.m. Kaylee comes on at 2. So I know. I'm just saying Kaylee's portion of the show starts at 2 p.m.
So as you're driving home in the Dodge Challenger?
I wish I could DVR it. Is there a way to do that, you think, with Sirius XM? I don't know. Because I get out of TV at 2.
I know there's a podcast.
It's the first thing I want to do is listen to this show, but I have to change my clothes. I have to go downstairs. It's in the garage. So.
All right, we'll figure it out for you, a solution. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul. Israel's military response to the Hamas attack earlier this month is prompting concerns that too many civilians in Palestine are being caught in the crossfire. The UN and medical staff say airstrikes are hitting closer to hospitals where civilians have sought shelter. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby tells CBS Mornings the president and his administration are constantly advising the Israelis to make sure civilians are protected.
We are not evaluating each and every strike they take, and we're not going to react in real time to each and every operation that they conduct. We have been in constant communication with the Israelis to stress the importance of respect for innocent civilian life, to respect the law of war, and to minimize casualties to the maximum extent possible.
Kirby tells CBS Israel does have every right to go after Hamas and eliminate the threat following the attack on October 7th. Hamas militants today released a new video purporting to show 3 women captured during that attack. One of the women delivers a statement criticizing Israel's response to the hostage crisis. A Denver court is hearing arguments today on whether former President Trump should be kept off the state's ballot because of his alleged role in the Capitol attack January 6th. The judge has already rebuffed efforts by Trump's attorneys to throw out the lawsuit. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution states no person may hold office if they engaged in insurrection or rebellion after swearing an oath to the Constitution. The last of the big three automakers, GM, has finally reached a tentative deal with the United Auto Workers. Those familiar with the agreement say it offers similar terms to the deal signed earlier by Ford, including a 25% hourly pay raise, plus cost of living allowances over the more than 4-year contract. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ are all advancing with a 0.7% gain right now on the S&P 500 index, up 26 points. Equities, however, still on track for their third monthly slump, the longest since March of 2020. Stocks rose. Oil right now, West Texas Intermediate crude down 3%. Treasuries slid as Israel's ground incursion into Gaza appears less extensive than investors had feared. Right now, we do have the 10-year yielding 4.89% with a 2-year 5.03%. Again, S&P up 0.7%. Dow Industrials up 335, up by 1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up now by 83 points. That is a gain of 0.7%. Spot gold down $6.50 the ounce to $19.99. Drop there of 0.3%. Again, crude worth repeating, slumping now by 3.1%. So it is an up day for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ. Wall Street looking at a very busy week ahead. Apple earnings, a jobs report, and then Wednesday, a Fed decision. Rob Williams is Chief Investment Strategist at Sage Advisory Services, and he was a guest right here on Bloomberg Markets.
We've got a ton of market-moving stuff. FOMC, that has the potential to be a non-event, although I would say they need to tinge a little bit more hawkish, at least acknowledge the strong data, keep the idea of a December hike out there at least.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Tape podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Sources tell Bloomberg GM has reached a tentative contract agreement with the UAW, bringing an end to a 6-week-old strike that has upended U.S. auto production and cost the industry billions of dollars. GM shares now up by 0.2%. Rival Ford down 1.4%. And Stellantis shares, they are down by 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. Let's talk Apple Computer. Apple, why not? It's not even, it's not even called Apple Computer anymore. Apple Inc., I guess, is the new one. But that stock, let's just refresh our memories here. $2.65 trillion market cap for Apple. The stock's up 30% this year. It's up about 0.7 today. They're going to have a product launch today. Kind of unusual timing, it seems like to me. Maybe they'll unveil some new iMacs, MacBook Pros, all that kind of stuff. So let's break it down with Mark Gurman. He's a chief correspondent covering technology and Apple for Bloomberg News. I have no idea where he is, but he's joining us somewhere via Zoom. Hey, Mark, thanks so much for joining us here. What are they calling this product launch tonight? Something Halloweenish, I think?
Maybe they should call it Apple Computer Inc. again, right? They changed the name to Apple Inc. in 2007 when they started selling the iPhone and some of the other mobile products. But today is all going to be about computers. And to answer your question, they're dubbing the event tonight Scary Fast, right? That's a flick at Halloween, right, in the U.S. and elsewhere, Tuesday evening, October 31st. But they're also going to be holding their keynote tonight on Monday evening, which is a nighttime event. Usually their keynotes would start about 15 minutes from now, but instead it's going to start for several hours. Now, the Scary Fast is a double meaning because they're referring to their new chips. And like you said, these new processors will be going into the MacBook Pro as well as the iMac.
So we don't really talk about the computers as much as, the iMacs and the MacBook Pros and that kind of stuff. It's all about the phone and the wearables and all that kind of stuff. Just refresh our memories what the computer part of their business means to them.
Yeah, the computer part of the business means a lot more than the revenue it generates. It generates between, let's say, $6 and $10 billion a quarter, right? It generates about 10 to 11% of their annual revenue each year, but it means so much more than that. Their most vocal consumers are the ones who are Mac loyalists. These are the people who tell their friends to buy a Mac, to tell their friends to buy other Apple products, to tell their friends to buy iPhones, right? To tell their friends to buy iPads. Now, the other thing Apple's trying to do is they're trying to get people to buy multiple products, right? They're trying to get people to buy not only a Mac, buy an iPhone, buy an iPad as well, and create that full ecosystem. And in many ways, the Mac sits at the center of the ecosystem. So it generates only about 10% of revenue, but it's so much more important than that.
Mark, talk to us about kind of the chips that are going into these things these days. Where are they getting their chips? And where's Apple? And I know there's been talk time to time about producing their own chips. Just give us kind of an update of what's happening on the chip side of the business.
Yeah, so today they're going to introduce 3 new chips, the M3, the M3 Pro, and the M3 Max. And these are their next generation versions of their in-house Mac processors. These are chips designed and developed entirely by Apple using what's known as an instruction set or a core framework licensed from ARM, right? We've been talking about ARM a lot lately. And they're actually manufactured in Taiwan by a company called TSMC. So these are in-house designs. And to make it very clear, this is the same exact chip technology that they've been using in the iPhone and the iPad and the Apple Watch for many years now. And the benefits for a computer are tremendous. Battery life, speed, efficiency, the ability to sort of customize the processor and the software to work together to create a better user experience. Before this transition, they were using Intel, which meant Intel was developing and producing the hardware, the components. Apple was producing the software. And so that necessitated a mix, right? Apple's doing one thing, Intel's doing another thing. And sometimes the hardware and the software didn't integrate as well as it does today, because they have one company now developing everything. So it's actually a pretty unique thing in the industry. And that has led to big revenue jumps, usability, as well as customer satisfaction on the company's computers lately.
Mark, let's switch gears and talk about China. It's obviously such a huge part of the Apple investment story, both as a supply chain issue in terms of sourcing product, as well as being an end market for its products. So arguably, there aren't too many companies more exposed to China than Apple. What's the concern there on the demand side, on the customer sales side? It just feels like there might be a growth in nationalism within China that may affect Apple product sales. What do we know right now?
We really won't know for sure until the very end of January or early February when Apple announces its Q1 results. That's going to be the first full quarter of iPhone 15 sales, and really the first full quarter until we start to catch wind that maybe there's an issue with Apple in China related to government bans, increased nationalism, and the new Huawei Mate phone, right? And so we really have to wait to know for sure. But the tea leaves we're reading, the demand we're seeing, the anecdotal evidence, some of the reports, the research reports we're seeing from there is indicative that there may be a little bit of a slowdown in China. Now, if you were to look at Apple's website, if you were to look at the lines at the retail stores in China, you're not really going to see the full picture, right? Those are showing pretty positive evidence of good things happening there. But as you know, the majority of people don't buy their iPhones through Apple. They buy them through carrier stores and such, right? And so we really got to wait to see the full numbers to get the full picture. But if the latest reporting out of the region is to believe, there's a bit of a slowdown there, which obviously, given that Greater China is about a fifth of Apple's sales and is where the majority of products are produced, anything going on negatively in China is something that we and investors and analysts very much need to pay attention to. So our eyes are glued to that situation.
How highly, I guess, is the Apple brand valued in China amongst consumers?
Yeah, the Apple brand is extremely strong in China. It's known as a very affluent brand. It's one of the top tier brands. You can put it in the same category of things like Chanel and Louis Vuitton and YSL potentially, right up there with fashion brands. And so in China, many people consider it a mix of technology and fashion. That's why the Apple Watch is so popular there. That's why the high-priced Macs are gaining in popularity there. That's why people in China are springing for the highest tier iPhones, right? These $1,500 US equivalent plus devices. But clearly, the brand is taking a little bit of, it's on a little bit of shaky ground right now. I wouldn't call it a 3-alarm fire, but it's something we're watching. And once we get the numbers in the next few months, we'll really know how bad the situation is there.
All right, Mark, thanks so much for joining us. Always appreciate getting a few minutes of your time. Mark Gurman, he's the chief correspondent, technology, and of course that means Apple for Bloomberg News. He is based out in our Los Angeles bureau, which is a awesome office there. Huge upgrade from where we were before, and now very, very nice as well. Mark Gurman, thanks so much. S&P 500, we are up 0.6%. of 1%. The Dow's up 1%, and the Nasdaq's up 0.5% here. Looking at yields are higher. The 10-year Treasury is up 6 basis points, 4.89% here. And on the commodities front, WTI crude oil off 3.5%. That is down to about $82.50 on WTI crude. More coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now. Lisa Mateo.
Paul, the last of the big three automakers has reached a tentative deal with the UAW. Sources tell Bloomberg that the agreement with General Motors includes a 25% hourly pay raise plus cost of living allowances over more than the 4-year contract. Bloomberg Detroit Bureau Chief David Welch says it still needs to be ratified.
Once that process is in place, then the companies can kind of start looking at where they're going to invest and how quickly they're going to ramp things up. And I think it's going to be tough for them to do, just kind of cranking up EV production and all this other stuff. It just takes a little bit of time to turn the ignition on these things.
The UAW has already reached tentative deals with Ford and Stellantis. Right now, General Motors up just a fraction, Stellantis down a fraction, Ford Motors down about 1.5%. Meantime, things are looking up at Toyota. Bloomberg's Steve Potisk has that story.
The world's biggest car maker is on track for another year of strong gains thanks to robust demand and improving supply conditions. Toyota's global sales climbed more than 8% in the April to September period from a year earlier to a record more than 5.5 million vehicles.
Now, that news not helping shares much right now. They're down about 2.5%. And Honda Motor said its global output in the fiscal first half increased by more than 6%, and Nissan's rose 2.8%. Right now,
even
Honda down about 4%.
Highs, the sort of AI rally that.
And Nissan down about 4% as well. And TikTok workers aren't happy. Sources tell the Wall Street Journal that the company is asking managers worldwide to give more employees lower ratings in performance reviews. And staffers fear it could reduce bonuses and lead to cutbacks. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney live here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Looking at these markets right here, continued move to the upside here. The S&P 500 is up 0.6%. The NASDAQ is up about 0.5%. Yields moving higher. The 10-year Treasury up 6 basis points, 4.89% here. On the commodities front, WTI crude oil off sharply, off 3.4% here, $82.60 for WTI crude oil. Bitcoin off about 0.3%, 34,460 for a Bitcoin. Tom Key not here, so we can quote that. Why not? Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul. Israel continues to send forces into Gaza as it slowly ramps up its ground invasion. Bloomberg's Oliver Crook is following developments from Tel Aviv.
The IDF has been saying today that more and more forces have entered Gaza in the last few hours, but still taking a very gradual approach to this. And really, the next question is, how long will this go on for? We've spoken to officials that say 6 weeks to 6 months. Again, it is very unclear. That part of the reason for that is there's still this question of hostages and, of course, the fear of escalation, which is still very present.
Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Tel Aviv. Iran's foreign ministry says Hamas has pledged to release non-Israeli hostages in the shortest time available. Now, a top Israeli official says aid shipments will soon pick up. House Speaker Mike Johnson is expecting an Israeli aid bill to pass the Republican-led chamber this week, but that's in direct contrast to President Biden's broader request for aid, including support for Ukraine. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern says the speaker could face some pushback on his plan.
He is trying to separate Israeli aid alongside what the White House wanted was aid for Ukraine, Taiwan, and other national security interests around the globe, but also with Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who also wanted to see a bigger package. So there's no doubt in my mind that Congress is going to be able to pass aid to Israel in a bipartisan fashion, but potentially this becomes a problem because he is trying to really decouple it from that broader package.
Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern reporting from Washington. Speaker Johnson also faces the challenge of funding the government before a November 17th deadline. Matthew Perry fans are leaving floral tributes outside the Friends apartment in New York City following the actor's death over the weekend. Officials confirm an autopsy was completed on Sunday, but no word yet on the cause of death. He was found dead in his hot tub at his Los Angeles home on Saturday. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Now back to you, Paul and Matt.
All right, Nancy Lyons, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney, live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. Let's talk donuts. Krispy Kreme might still be a popular choice for donut lovers, but the boom in weight loss drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy has one Wall Street firm warning investors about the stock. Truist Securities downgraded shares to hold from buy and cut the price target to $13 from $20, citing the uncertain impact of drugs known as GLP-1s on packaged food snacks. Analysts led by Bill Chappell expect the overhang will not fade for 6 to 12 months, if not longer. Quote, we believe in the Krispy Kreme model, Chappell wrote in a note on Monday. However, we have a difficult time recommending the name at least until the GLP-1 wave has started to form. Shares fell as much as 3.6% in New York on Monday. Shares are up 25% year to date through last close. Among analysts tracked by Bloomberg, Krispy Kreme has 3 buy recommendations, 4 holds, and 0 sells. Chappell says he has, quote, no idea what the impact of GLPs will be on overall food consumption, and that is the problem. It's too early for there to be an accurate estimate, he added. It would have been better for Krispy Kreme and peers if GLP usage was already impacting third quarter results, as it would allow investors to forecast how it would affect the business in 2024 and 2025. So styling back on some of those packaged food companies along as per one analyst. Tracking these markets here, again, green on the screen here, a solid day to the week of trading. We have a lot of economic data coming up this week, including the jobs non-farm payroll on Friday. We've got a lot of big earnings this week. It's another busy week for earnings. Maybe one of the highlights, certainly for tech investors, will be Apple after the close. Right now, Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons starting at 2 o'clock. That starts right now.
Now, our nation's capital. This is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself. Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Israel sends more troops into Gaza. Welcome to the fastest show in politics, as Israeli forces also conduct a raid in the West Bank and another airstrike in Syria as the war with Hamas enters a new phase. We're joined by Brett Bruin, former U.S. diplomat, now president of the Global Situation Room, for the latest on this. Speaker Mike Johnson says he will bring Israeli funding as a standalone bill to the House floor this week. And the latest polling from Iowa shows Nikki Haley on the ascent in a field that no longer includes Mike Pence. Analysis today from our panel: Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist Rick Davis, joined by Alvin Jordan, Vice President at Rock Solutions, Democratic strategist. We've got a lot to cover on this Monday. Let's get to it, beginning as always with Wall Street. An update on trading now with Charlie Pellet in New York.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Happy Monday. Lots going on in your world, lots going on Wall Street. We begin with the numbers. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ solidly in the green, but oil is retreating, down 3.5%. West Texas Intermediate now at 82.52 a barrel. S&P has halted a slide that drove the gauge to oversold levels. The S&P up 24 points now, 41.41, a gain of 0.6%. Dow Industrials up 339, up 1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 63, that is a gain of 0.5%. 10-year yield 4.89%, with a 2-year that's now yielding 5.03%. Spot gold down $7 the ounce to $19.98, a drop right now of 0.4%. So stocks have slumped this month in their worst October performance in 6 years, hurt by a surge in bond yields and renewed geopolitical concerns. A disappointing showing from tech stocks has also weighed on sentiment in recent weeks. Sarah Kunst is a managing director at Clio Capital, and she was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Radio.
Even though they've fallen off those highs, you know, the sort of AI rally that we saw earlier this year certainly pushed a lot of them back up. You know, individual names like Meta have had just a tremendous year overall, even though they're not necessarily doing the best right now. So, you know, tech stocks might still be pretty frothy, but I certainly don't think that they're nearly as bullish as they were a year and a half ago.
And she mentioned Meta. Meta shares up now by 1.7%. By the way, you can hear more of that conversation on the Talks podcast. Oil is retreating. Oil slumping as Israel faces growing pressure to limit its bombardments amid negotiations for the release of hostages. Exxon shares, they're unchanged on the day. BP down 1%. Chevron up 0.7%. EOG Resources down 1.1%. Pioneer Natural down 0.1%. Again, recapping, stocks are higher. S&P up 24 points, a gain there of 0.6%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you. Welcome to Monday, the Monday edition of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We're painting out of several buckets today, and we'll bring you the latest on Israel, on the new Republican speaker, and the agenda ahead for the House. No one in town right now. Lawmakers don't come back until Wednesday, as a matter of fact. And, of course, the campaign trail with new numbers today following Mike Pence dropping out of the race over the weekend. So let's get to it. We begin in Israel as we prepare to bring in Brett Bruin. More Israeli forces have entered Gaza. This headline crossing the terminal, 10:55 a.m. local time. More forces rolling into Gaza with the invasion advancing gradually and according to plan, according to spokesman Daniel Hagari, who says now 239 people are thought to be held by Hamas. John Kirby, speaking for the National Defense Apparatus at the White House earlier today on ABC's Good Morning America.
The situation in Gaza is very perilous, which is why the president spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday to make sure we can continue to accelerate that flow and increase that flow of humanitarian goods.
The latest, though, on the terminal, Army says captive soldier freed in ground fight. This is brand new. Israel says a female soldier held captive in Gaza was freed as the Army extends ground operations in the territory. But of course, we saw a lot happen over the weekend. We saw Israel conduct a raid in the West Bank. We saw another airstrike in Syria. We also saw skirmishes to the north, where there are great fears that a second front could be opening. And that's where we begin our conversation with Brett Bruen, the president of the Global Situation Room, former U.S. diplomat, back with us here on Bloomberg. Brett, it's great to see you. This is the new phase, as announced by Israel, and there's a lot of pressure, of course, coming upon Israel to spare the lives of Palestinian civilians. How is this going so far? How effective has this operation been?
Well, look, obviously news of the release of this Israeli soldier is encouraging and obviously will bolster Prime Minister Netanyahu and his efforts to expeditiously undertake an operation. And it's one, Joe, I think it's important for listeners to take account of the fact that after 9/11, after the rise of ISIS in Iraq, there was no talk of a ceasefire. There was no notion that a terrorist organization was going to be able to abide by those terms, or quite frankly, that we would be any better off, any safer in pursuing one. So Israel sees the situation through that lens, and it's an understandable one after having suffered the most significant terrorist attack on its soil since the founding of the Jewish state. So it obviously is a very difficult endeavor, and one that, because of how Hamas has ensconced itself in and amongst civilians, obviously, these operations will have, as a result, a high number of civilian casualties.
Hamas says 8,306 Palestinians have been killed since the 7th of October. Authorities in Gaza say more than 3,000 of them children. Brett, this is a very difficult narrative here for an operation that's still widening. To what extent is Israel, in fact, trying to spare civilians' lives? We know we're talking about dense urban warfare and a pretty tall order for Israeli troops who are being sent into harm's way as well.
And obviously, Joe, those numbers are truly tragic, and ones that speak to just how difficult these operations have been, will be going forward. And yet, obviously, it is part of, unfortunately, the kind of military operation that Hamas initiated. Hamas, chose to reinitiate its attacks on Israel, and that led to the death of 1,400 civilians, capture, as you mentioned earlier, of 250-odd civilians as well as soldiers. All of that creates what is, without question, an extraordinarily difficult and dangerous situation. And it's why I think it's important that not only the U.S., but particularly regional partners are pressured to do more. You have to ask questions, for instance, why has Egypt made it so difficult to get humanitarian aid in, let alone allowing Gazans out? You have to wonder why there have not been more efforts by the likes of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, as well as other Gulf states and close U.S. partners to try and pressure on both sides, that there are fewer rocket attacks, that there is a commitment to swearing off the kinds of brutal tactics that were used in these attacks by Hamas. So I think there is, obviously, as we often discuss, diplomacy has to be central to these efforts. Obviously, the military operations are underway and will continue, but ultimately the solution is one that runs through diplomatic efforts.
Is it really a realistic conversation, though, Brett, to be talking about sparing civilian life when we're seeing the use of bunker-busting bombs to try to get to these tunnels underneath Gaza? There are buildings on top of those tunnels. And when you start getting into civilians as human shields, the stated goal is to eliminate Hamas. Can you eliminate Hamas without killing scores more civilians?
Well, I think first, the initial phase of the Israeli operation did unfortunately involve quite a number of air assaults. It's the same tactics that the U.S., that our allies use, whether it was in Israel, Afghanistan, or in other places where ahead of sending in your troops, you're going to want to take out some of those command and control points, some of those rocket batteries and other high-value military targets. And yes, the images coming out of Gaza are absolutely horrific, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And we should, as I think we have heard over the last several days and the last couple of weeks, efforts by the Biden administration, by other world leaders to impress upon Israel the importance of doing everything possible to limit civilian casualties. And I think we've seen some results to that, whether it was delaying in that initial invasion or in just the last couple of days, restoration of telephone, internet service into Gaza as well.
You, I'm sure, saw images from this airport in Russia over the weekend, Brett. Makakala, if I'm saying it right, capital of Dagestan, where a mob went on a rampage after a Red Wings plane from Tel Aviv arrived. There are images and video of crowd running through the airport, chanting Allahu Akbar, looking for Jews, trying to get onto the engine. Somebody got onto the wing of the airplane. They had to shut the entire airport down. And we have further news on this today, Brett, that Vladimir Putin is meeting with top government officials to address these anti-Semitic protests in what we should note is a predominantly Muslim region of the country. John Kirby spoke about this earlier today on ABC. Here's what he said.
It's certainly worrisome footage to see all that hatred and potential violence against Jewish passengers on an airplane. I mean, it's absolutely unacceptable. And I mean, these are two entities, Russia and Hamas, that want to wipe neighboring countries off the map. So it's very concerning. Now, I don't know that there was any high-level endorsement of that activity, but it's definitely worrisome.
He's referring to a meeting with Hamas that Vladimir Putin had. And I just wonder what you can tell us about all of this, Brett. Obviously, this was chilling to see and something that we wouldn't have thought necessarily would have involved Vladimir Putin to the extent that it does here. But how concerned are you about what happened over the weekend in Russia?
Absolutely was chilling and brought back echoes of the stories I used to hear from my grandparents who left Russia, Eastern Ukraine, and Moldova at the time because of pogroms, those attacks that took place against Jews in various villages across Russia and neighboring countries. So this ought to set off alarm bells in capitals around the world. It ought to, Joe, I think especially here in the U.S., where some of the rhetoric used by politicians on both sides of the aisle, whether it's in describing Israel's actions, whether it's in describing what Israel or the United States should do, need to be much, much more careful. The language that I've seen in just the last couple of weeks in public statements and interviews, as well as social tweets, is adding more fuel to this fire, is exacerbating and, quite frankly, is endangering Americans with some of the suggestions like Vivek Ramaswamy over the weekend, who suggested what ought to be done, and I'm not going to repeat it, to Hamas soldiers. These kinds of very vicious, very just extreme descriptions of the situation, and quite frankly, inaccurate descriptions or ill-considered descriptions are exacerbating the conditions and are leading to the kind of mass hysteria that played out yesterday at that Russian airport.
Yeah, mass hysteria is another good way of putting it. And this comes against the backdrop of calls for Benjamin Netanyahu's resignation. Brett, while you're still with us, I wonder if you could speak to this as he is now apologizing for blaming the security chiefs in a tweet that was then deleted. It's kind of a long story here, but he doesn't seem to be keeping the people of Israel with him. As I look at the Jerusalem Post, 4 of 5 Jewish Israelis believe the government and Prime Minister Netanyahu are to blame for the mass infiltration of Hamas terrorists into Israel. How much trouble is he in?
Oh, without question, there will be a high political price to pay for what obviously details still to be forthcoming, but completely unacceptable that Hamas fighters could get into Israel. And ultimately, the buck has to stop with Netanyahu at some point through these investigations, and ultimately a determination of accountability. I think both he, as well as perhaps some of his cabinet members, will be ushered out, and hopefully Israel is able to put forward a government that is going to both address the current crisis, but let's not forget, Joe, there are a lot of issues when it comes to settler activity, when it comes to the judicial reform that Netanyahu was pursuing beforehand, which have obviously created a very fragile foundation for democracy and for peace and stability in Israel.
Brett, it's good to see you. Thanks for starting your week with us. Brett Bruin, of course, at the Global Situation Room here on Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we assemble our panel today. Rick Davis is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist, joined by Democratic analyst Alvin Jordan, vice president at Rock Solutions. We'll have plenty of time to dive into this. Though, Rick, I wonder your thoughts on what you saw over the weekend with the minute or so time that we have. Is this next phase just the tip of the iceberg, or is this the ground invasion you were waiting for?
Well, I think this is a ground invasion we were anticipating, but I'm not sure it represents just the next phase. I mean, this is such a multi-phase attack plan that the Israelis have, and I would say that we have to give them time to really formulate that plan and let it see what happens when it hits the ground, what kind of opposition they'll get, whether or not they're successful with negotiating through the Qataris to get hostages back. I mean, this is a multi-stage effort, and I think that the ground forces being there, rolling up terrorist elements within the Hamas organization is just one aspect of that.
We'll have the deep dive next with our panel, not only what's happening on the ground in Israel, but here in Washington, where the request for funding will be taken up by the House this week. The new speaker talking about it over the weekend. That'll be Israel funding alone, however. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. West Texas Intermediate crude oil back below $82 a barrel. WTI now down by 4.4%. Stocks are higher. Oil is selling off. Treasuries slipped as Israel's ground incursion into Gaza appears less extensive than investors had feared. S&P 500 halted a slide that drove the gauge to oversold levels. The S&P now higher by 33 points. That is an advance right now of 0.8%. Dow Industrial's up 409 points. That is a gain of 1.3%, while the Nasdaq Composite Index is up 91 points, higher by about 0.7%. 10-year yield 4.90% with a 2-year right now 5.04%. Gold is trading lower by 0.5%, 19.96 the ounce on the precious metal. And again, crude oil, worth repeating, down 4.3%, 81.98 right now for a barrel of WTI. SoFi Technology shares lower after earnings. SoFi down 2.3%. The online lender increased its revenue forecast for 2023. It also said deposits more than tripled from a year earlier. Again, recapping, stocks are higher with the S&P up 33, up 0.8%. Crude down 4.3%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
The new Speaker of the House says he stands ready to pass aid for Israel as soon as this week. In fact, it looks like there will be a vote come Thursday. That's the reporting at Bloomberg. Mike Johnson speaking with Fox over the weekend, remembering that the supplemental request that came from the White House included funding for Israel, for Ukraine, $60 billion worth, also for Taiwan, and then the rest for border security. That's the way the Senate is tackling this. Apparently not this Republican-led House. Here's the new Speaker.
Well, listen, we're going to move a standalone Israel funding bill this week in the House. I know our colleagues, our Republican colleagues in the Senate have a similar measure. We believe that that is a pressing and urgent need. There are lots of things going on around the world that we have to address, and we will. But right now, what's happening in Israel takes the immediate attention.
All right, let's get into this with our panel as the ground assault in Israel enters a new phase, something we were just discussing with Rep. Bruin. Rick Davis joins, of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist, today with Democratic analyst Alvin Jordan at Rock Solutions. Alvin, it's great to have you back. Thanks for joining the conversation. What's going to happen here if the House decides to tackle Israel funding alone, knowing that the Senate and the White House see this differently? Isn't this kind of inevitable how this is going to go? It'll slow things down until the combined bill actually becomes law at some point? Or are these going to go one at a time? Each cause gets its own piece of legislation?
I think the hope truly is to have these go one at a time. And I think that the new speaker correctly points out that by prioritizing the immediate need in this particular instance, that the turmoil in Israel, I think, demands is a great place and a clear point of view, I think, as far as looking at the situation as it stands. And I think we would all hope that as opposed to kind of backlogging and jamming this up a bit more, that this would free it up and just kind of set the basis for an understanding that we kind of have to tackle, kind of one bite at the elephant at a time.
Rick, it's not lost on us that Mitch McConnell is appearing today in Louisville with Oksana Markarova, the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., who is no stranger to American media. This new speaker is going to have a real issue with the Republican leader in the Senate, isn't he?
Yeah, he's got an issue, with the approach that Speaker Johnson's taking by taking these one by one. But he's also got a problem with his own Senate Republican caucus. Just recently, J.D. Vance, Mike Lee, Ted Cruz from Texas, they all indicated a willingness to move forward right away with an Israeli bill. to fund that supplemental request and to do it on an independent basis. So in addition to problems he's got in the House of Representatives moving forward on a standalone basis with Israel funding, he's got a sort of back effort in the Senate that he has to stall in order to just make sure his own caucus is on his side.
Well, you do wonder how this is going to come together, and if Ukrainian funding reaches the $60 billion or so that the president is looking for, much of that's going to be spent domestically, Alvin. And I wonder if you see the messaging coming out of the White House as being effective here. When you hear not another dollar for Ukraine from some on Capitol Hill, they're not thinking about our own munitions here, our own stockpiles, and our own work with American defense contractors. Do you agree?
I think the important part to remember here is, just taking a step back, our, kind of new speaker has already shown the ability to, unite what seemingly seems to be a kind of divided group. And so I think you have to kind of look at the statements from the administration and from the president kind of with that same lens as of, it is very clear where the administration and where the president wants this to go from a funding standpoint. But we really, I think, have to do the work in prioritizing what exactly that means, considering just the amount of not just funding that we've already sent out of the door, but just considering the turmoil that the world is in and the amount of assistance that will be needed. I think anything hasty that kind of overlooks that true point is just not in the best interest holistically at this given time.
Well, when you take a look at some of the other items facing the new speaker, as soon as this week, it looks like an interesting party here, Rick. It also includes not just an effort to fund the government with a shutdown looming on November 17th, and we can talk about that, of course, but 3 privileged resolutions. One to expel George Santos, 2 others to censure members, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Representative Tlaib, who I realize is not a Republican in this case, but the speaker still has to herd cats in this House of Representatives. Should all of these come to the floor, and what happens when they do?
Yeah, no, look, I mean, these are most of the junk resolutions. They're not going to pass. They'll get scheduled in due course by the Rules Committee, and they'll come up in regular business. So I don't think those things are going to sort of slow him down. And I would be shocked if he took any of his time and prestige as the brand new Speaker of the House to even address them much publicly, right? I mean, these are sort of leftovers, from a period of time that he's trying to avoid, which is sort of the balkanization of both parties fighting with each other internally and then taking those fights out, onto the floor of the House. So he's got his work cut out for him to be able to accomplish this. But every indication I've got from his allies on Capitol Hill is that he's going to resist as much as he can these kinds of public stunts and try to get some of the business done, knowing that, as you say, Joe, we've got to fund the government, we've got to fund Ukraine, we've got to fund Israel, we've got to fund the border problems. There's a real need to act in the House to catch up to where the Senate is on these appropriations bills. I mean, he's got other things to worry about that actually have real upside for the country.
There's a congressman from Ohio named Max Miller, and he wants to change the threshold on the motion to vacate. This is, of course, how Kevin McCarthy got fired, and it's still technically hanging over the speaker here to force 112 members in this case of the majority or minority to sign on to the resolution to fire a Speaker of the House. Does that need to happen, Alvin? Will it happen?
I hope it doesn't happen. I think just as we've seen just up until this point, just how much this really just muddies the waters and just gives a larger barrier, to entry as far as allowing the speaker to do their job. I think, more than anything right now, kind of the collaboration and the work across the aisle just really matters more than anything. And I think giving any kind of credence or just look back to these types of things, I think just slows the process. So you would like for for us to find ourselves in a place where this isn't something that continues to kind of become that dark cloud over the speakership, if you will.
I think he wants to make it more difficult, though, and actually raise the threshold. Is that something you'd support to give the speaker a slightly easier ride here?
Yeah, I mean, in that way, sure. I just think that up until this point, we really need to. I mean, we're talking about funding and sending money out of the door, and just finding ourselves in a place where we're working collaboratively. And so I just think that in this particular instance, sure, making it a harder threshold is fine, but we really need to kind of move past this topic of discussion, which seems to keep creeping back up in the discussion.
Well, what do you do then, Rick? Do you raise the threshold or get rid of it altogether?
Well, you can't get rid of it altogether, but there are mechanisms to make it more difficult, if not downright unfeasible. And again, they probably ought to do that. They should have done it the day Johnson got elected. Every day that goes by, guys like Matt Gaetz get a little bit more oxygen. I mean, he's been chastised, right? I mean, here's one guy who was more desperate to get a speaker elected than anybody else because he was to blame for 3.5 weeks of complete, malfunction, lack of function of the House of Representatives. I mean, that's a heck of a burden to carry around with you for the balance of your term. So I suspect that there's nobody who's really keen to exercise a motion to vacate right now. And so they ought to just clean that up. But again, I don't think there's any there right now. I think between now and the end of the year, they've got so much business to do that there is a sense, as Alvin said, of a new esprit de corps to get things done, a little bit of bipartisanship, hopefully. And I think it'll be mostly tested by this Ukraine resolution. Will the speaker put a Ukraine resolution on the floor without a majority of the Republicans supporting it? Because it'll pass overwhelmingly with almost the entire Democratic caucus backing it, but will he allow a bipartisan solution?
We will find out. Rick Davis, Alvin Jordan, great panel. They stay with us as we turn to the campaign trail next. New numbers from Iowa, Ann Selzer's latest, just out. And of course, it's all about number 2. We'll have a lot more on that ahead after a check on world and national news with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been speaking amid a growing ground offensive in Gaza. We'll be keeping an eye on it and will relay any information that we hear. The United Auto Workers strike appears to be over. Sources tell Bloomberg the union has reached a tentative deal with GM that puts an end to negotiations after the strike began more than 6 weeks ago. President Biden is directing the U.S. government to take a sweeping approach to artificial intelligence regulation, his most significant action yet to rein in the emerging technology. We talked about it with Bloomberg Government's Congress reporter Zach Cohen.
Developers such as Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet's Google would be directed to put powerful AI models through safety tests and submit results to the government before their public release. This is only for future systems, not currently existing ones, but they would be vetted for potential risks to national or economic security, health, safety.
Again, Bloomberg Government's Zach Cohen. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 140 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. The Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ are all advancing. Stocks right now trading very close to session highs. Oil down to $82 a barrel. Treasuries are slipping as Israel's ground incursion into Gaza appeared less extensive than investors had feared. The S&P right now up 42 at 41.59. That is a gain of 1%. Dow Jones Industrial Average now up 483 points, higher by 1.5%. The NASDAQ Composite Index is up 118 points. That is a gain right now of 0.9%. 10-year yield 4.89%, with a 2-year that's yielding 5.04%. Spot gold, little change now, down $7 the ounce to $19.99, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is down 3.4%, $82.63 for a barrel of WTI. Federal Reserve officials convene in Washington beginning tomorrow, and the government issues October's employment report. A busy week for U.S. economic data. And with a look ahead, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Federal Reserve officials meet on interest rates on Tuesday and Wednesday, and economists say the odds are against another rate hike this week. Bloomberg Economics sees the Fed leaving the door open for more interest rate hikes as inflation lingers. Also this week, the U.S. employment report Friday. Economists see October payroll growth slowing to roughly half of September's strong gain of 336,000. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Broadcom and software maker VMware say their $61 billion merger is on track to close before a November deadline, working to reassure investors while China drags out its review of the deal. Shares of Broadcom down 0.4%. VMware, little change, down less than 0.1%. Again, recapping, stocks are pushing higher, with the S&P up now by 43 points, up 1.1%, very close to session highs. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just wrapped up a news conference in Israel, generating a couple of headlines on the terminal. For starters, and not a surprise, he says he will not agree to any ceasefire with Hamas. And getting to one of the issues we were speaking to earlier, calls for his resignation after, over the weekend, apologizing for blaming Israeli military and intelligence officials for the Hamas terror attack and missing the cues that might have led to it. Dismissing calls for his resignation as prime minister. Officially, he says he is working for Hamas to resign. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg Sound On. The war with Hamas was a huge issue over the weekend in Las Vegas, as the Republican candidates spoke to the RJC, the Republican Jewish Coalition. Nikki Haley, among others, speaking to the crowd. Donald Trump was there. He said he would reinstate the Muslim ban if reelected. Nikki Haley went after the former president for his remarks recently about Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas.
While the polls are notable, principles matter a lot more. As president, I will not compliment Hezbollah, nor will I criticize Israel's prime minister in the middle of a tragedy and war.
Not exactly a standing ovation, but she wasn't booed for it either. As we reassemble our panel, Rick Davis and Alvin Jordan. Rick, of course, Republican strategist, Alvin, Democratic analyst from Rock Solutions. This is a must-stop, Rick. Obviously, when you're speaking to the RJC, they each took their own path here. And, of course, Mike Pence made some news, dropping out of the race. And that really kind of became the headline for the campaign over the weekend. I don't know if you were expecting the former vice president to be the next one to drop here, but how important is that for this whole conversation that we're having? Other than former President Trump and Nikki Haley, he was the only one with direct foreign policy experience on that stage.
Yeah, I think it's, it's important to note that, you're right. I mean, he had incredible foreign policy chops. The 4 years he spent with President Trump, he was all over the world developing these relationships. And he wasn't able to gain traction in Iowa, a very key state, especially for a Midwesterner like himself. And I thought it was actually very impressive that he took the RJC conference to announce that he was suspending his campaign, because that would have been a group that I think, probably would have been more supportive of Vice President Pence than most of the Republican crowds you have, especially during a crisis like this, and especially due to the fact that he was such a strong supporter of Israel throughout his political career, but especially as vice president. So all that lined up perfectly for him. I think that it does put more focus onto Nikki Haley, one of the very few other Republicans besides the president himself, who have actionable foreign policy experience. And she's been willing to make it a case for that on the campaign trail even before the war broke out in Israel. So she got to that trough first. Obviously, the President Trump has made many missteps along the way, especially related to this current fight for Gaza and against Hamas. And so, advantage Nikki Haley. Consolidation is important to her. Getting the spotlight on her commander-in-chief credentials is important to her. And showing a true contrast with the president, as she did in her speech at the RJC, was, I think, a really good weekend for her.
Well, she certainly has a good showing in this Ann Selzer poll. This is NBC News Des Moines Register. Shows Donald Trump dominating the field. That's not news. He's leading everyone by nearly 30%. But Nikki Haley rising into second place to tie Ron DeSantis at 16%, tied at second. Reminding you that in August, Nikki Haley was at 6% in this poll. Ron DeSantis was at 19%. And so, Alvin, when this really starts to be looking like a second place coalescing around Nikki Haley, is that not Joe Biden's great worry right now? He wants to run against Donald Trump. Does a Republican nominee named former Governor Nikki Haley keep him up at night?
I think it absolutely has to keep him up at night. I think any formidable politician with, as you mentioned, kind of the chops to match and the resume to match is exactly what the Democrats and Joe Biden just don't want to see. I know we've kind of joked in our back and forth that this was or has been at least a race to second place. But I think as Nikki Haley's base grows and she continues to outpace kind of what is that second tier group, I think you definitely have to get a little bit nervous if you're the Biden team, for sure.
What do you think of the results of this poll, Rick? The trajectory for Ron DeSantis and the trajectory for Nikki Haley are hard to deny.
Yeah, it is hard to deny. I mean, DeSantis has been, sort of just going nowhere. And we've been talking about the phenomena that he has, because he has to make a mark in Iowa. He doesn't have another state to really campaign in. All his $100 million super PAC is getting spent in Iowa. And the fact that he's actually ticking down in this survey is really bad news for him. In reverse, Nikki Haley, who's actually been making moves in New Hampshire, and actually we've seen in public polls increasing her capacity and even outstripping DeSantis in New Hampshire, now can add Iowa as a potential battleground, because she almost doubled the amount of support that she had since the last Des Moines Register poll. And frankly, with very good underlying data, a little bit I've been able to dig in on this poll. I mean, she doubled her numbers with independents while everybody else either went down or stayed the same. So, independents make up almost a quarter of all the caucus goers. And it's a likely group that would really attach themselves to her. And all the while, nobody else in the field moving. No Chris Christie, no Vivek Ramaswamy. None of these other people have made any progress.
Now, of course, Mike Pence is out, so we'll see where his couple of percentage points go in Iowa. With Rick Davis and Alvin Jordan, I'm Joe Matthew. We'll look a little bit more closely at his exit from the race coming up next on the fastest show in politics. Live from Washington, this is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Best level of the day for the Dow Jones Industrial Average, now up 516 points, up 1.6%. We've got a complete market recap coming up in just under 7 minutes. On an update for the markets, SoFi Technologies now lower by 1.5% after the online lender increased its revenue forecast for 2023 and said deposits more than tripled from a year earlier. CEO Anthony Noto said third quarter total deposits jumped to $15.7 billion, topping the $14.9 billion average estimate of analysts surveyed by Bloomberg. Western Digital will split into two separate publicly traded companies after talks to merge with Kioxia Holdings fell apart. And with more on the story, here's Bloomberg's Tom Busby.
Charlie, the storage maker will spin off its flash business, which focuses on memory for computers, devices, and portable drives. Now, according to an investor presentation, Western Digital's remaining business will focus on selling high-capacity memory to cloud data centers. The announcement comes alongside the company's results for the fiscal first quarter. It reported net revenue of $2.75 billion. That's a 26% drop from the same period a year ago. Its flash business declined 9.6% to $1.56 billion, while its HDD unit declined 40.7% to just $1.2 billion. Charlie?
And that's Tom Busby reporting. Shares of Western Digital are up now by 6.75%. And those are some of our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pelletin. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We're live from Washington, where we'll add Kaylee Lyons to the conversation coming up in just 5 minutes. Some final thoughts ahead from Rick and Alvin, our panel today as well, after we get up to date on world and national news. Nancy Lyons has that from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel is making systematic progress in its military campaign against Hamas, but he says Israel will not agree to any ceasefire. And during a briefing just minutes ago, he says all hostages must be freed immediately and unconditionally. On the humanitarian front, there is some promising news in Gaza, where U.S. officials say more aid is reaching Palestinian civilians. Matt Miller is a spokesman with the State Department.
Yesterday, 45 trucks carrying food, water, and other humanitarian aid moved through the Rafah crossing into Gaza, marking the highest single-day shipment to date and bringing the total number of trucks that have made it into Gaza to 150. We aim to surpass that number today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Matt Miller says communications in Gaza have also been restored, and they're making some progress in providing fuel supplies. One side effect of Israel's war effort is the impact on the Israeli economy. Bloomberg's Amy Morris says it's a COVID-like shock impacting activity from restaurants to banks.
The shutdowns are being compared to the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, with schools, offices, and building sites emptying or opening for only a few hours a day. Israel mobilized a record 350,000 reservists. That's 8% of their workforce. Now, this has upended everything from banking to agriculture, costing the government the equivalent of $2.5 billion each month. That's according to a top Israeli lender. Israeli stocks are the world's worst performers since fighting erupted. Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
Both the House and Senate are hoping to push 3 spending bills over the finish line this week, with the November 17th government funding deadline drawing closer. Lawmakers will have to reconcile each chamber's bills, and so far there have been no preliminary discussions on that. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Now back to you, Joe.
Right, Nancy, thank you. Of course, we referenced it a bit earlier this hour, the exit of Mike Pence, the former vice president of the United States, from the campaign trail. Kind of quiet over the weekend, to be honest, as he delivered the message at the RJC, letting everyone know he had made up his mind. Here he is.
The Bible tells us that there's a time for every purpose under heaven. I'm traveling across the country over the past 6 months. I came here to say it's become clear to me this is not my time. So after much prayer and deliberation, I have decided to suspend my campaign for president effective today.
There it is. Little murmur in the crowd. And some final thoughts from our panel, Rick Davis and Alvin Jordan. Rick, is his political career over?
Well, it depends on what he wants to make of it. He says he's going to continue to fight for conservative values. It'd be interesting to see if he engages with Donald Trump throughout the course of the campaign, or even endorses somebody like Nikki Haley in the course of the campaign's remaining, fall months. So I think there's still a lot we can hear from him, and whether or not it makes an impact, we'll see from the polling.
Alvin Jordan, what do you have next for Mike Pence? A talk show, retirement, spend more time with the grandkids? What do you think?
Well, I lived in the state of Indiana while Pence was governor there, and so I would say anything in the state of Indiana would probably serve him well. I mean, you would hate to see decades of service and kind of conservative credentials become irrelevant at this point. So I think Indiana is always a great place to go home and regroup.
I guess that's right. That's where Donald Trump found him for his most recent job. He was a conservative talk show host. Rick, you think he goes back into radio?
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure his voice, he's got a lot to say. And look, running for president is something that takes all your time. He'll take some time with his family and decide where he goes from here.
All right, Rick Davis, Alvin Jordan. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
nation's capital. This is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover them.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Speaker Mike Johnson has got a long to-do list, but what can he get done? Welcome to Hour 2 of Sound On as the new Speaker of the House promises a standalone bill to fund Israel on the House floor this week, even as the Senate moves in another direction and a government shutdown looms just, 3 weeks away. We're joined by Jack Fitzpatrick, Bloomberg Government Appropriations and Congress expert, and we'll have our weekly conversation with Mick Mulvaney, the co-founder of the Freedom Caucus, former acting chief of staff in the Trump White House. 3 up and 3 down. You might have heard it. GM cuts a tentative deal with the UAW. That takes care of all 3 of the big 3 automakers. We'll be joined by Arthur Wheaton, Director of Labor Studies at Cornell, and his expertise on the way forward here. Let's get up to date first on Wall Street, though. An update on trading, to be specific, with Charlie Pellet. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Happy Monday. 509-point jump right now for the Dow Jones Industrial Average. You alluded to the automakers. GM up by 0.4%. Ford shares down by 1% now. Stellantis up by about 0.1%. Stocks higher across the board. In fact, right now we are very close to session highs on the S&P. The Dow up 506. As I mentioned, up 1.6%. The S&P up 48, higher now by 1.2%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up now by 146 points. For NASDAQ, that is a gain of 1.2%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.89% with a 2-year right now, 5.04%. Spot gold, $19.98 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude is slumping 3.1%, $82.87 a barrel. And we've got spot gold at $19.98 the ounce, down by about 0.4%. Bottom line here, stocks rose, oil fell to $82 a barrel. Treasuries slipped as Israel's ground incursion into Gaza appeared less extensive than investors had feared. Equities, however, still on track for their 3rd monthly slump, the longest since March of 2020. Dan Skelly is head of Model Portfolio Solutions, and at Morgan Stanley, he said, when it comes to the selling in October, there is more to go.
When you look at mega cap tech over the last week or so, you are starting to see a pretty pronounced impact from that sector as well. So listen, we're not in the camp that we're going to see a dramatic sell-off from here, but we think we could certainly see more mixed results.
And just getting word that Elon Musk's X is now valued at $19 billion, that according to Fortune magazine. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you. Welcome to Hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On, Monday edition. It doesn't feel like a Monday at all, Kaylee.
Oh, it very much does.
Kaylee Lines is with us, of course. The thing is, Kaylee has an excuse. Kaylee ran a marathon over the weekend. I slept through the weekend, and I feel like I need another weekend now. Half marathon. Congratulations. You do this like every weekend now.
Oh,
you have a Saturday, Kaylee has a marathon. It's completely the way things work around here. You're just killing time for the appropriations to begin.
Exactly.
I understand how this works. Well, we did get a speaker last week, and that was a big deal around here. Now, the speaker's got a menu here of things that a lot of people are asking for, and it's unclear exactly how all of this is going to work and whether the government will stay open through November 17th, though I know Jack is going to tell us that it will happen, right?
Well, he very well may. Should we ask Jack?
Well, we certainly can.
Rotates in chair.
There he is now. Jack Fitzpatrick, Bloomberg Government, from next door on K Street. It's good to see you, sir. Thanks for coming in. Not a big shocker to hear Mike Johnson say over the weekend he wants a standalone vote on Israel funding. He said last week, bifurcate was the word he used. Now speaking with Fox News, he does it again just for good measure. Here's Mike Johnson when asked about the big request for money for Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and the border.
Well, listen, we're going to move a standalone Israel funding bill this week in the House. I know our colleagues, our Republican colleagues in the Senate have a similar measure. We believe that that is a pressing and urgent need. There are lots of things going on around the world that we have to address, and we will. But right now, what's happening in Israel takes the immediate attention.
So how is this going to work when the Senate apparently wants to do it the way the president is asking? Mitch McConnell is appearing in Louisville today with the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S. to make the point. Do we already have a standoff?
This is a fight. I'm not sure it is the fight. On one hand, yes, the president said, give me a bunch of things all in one. Yeah. And there are lawmakers who think it makes sense to put Israel, Ukraine, U.S.-Mexico border, Taiwan, and the Indo-Pacific funding all together in one big thing. House Republican leadership clearly does not agree. But, I remember just a week ago or so, a group of House Republicans who are pretty pro-Ukraine, they were led by Dan Crenshaw, sort of defense hawks, said the real question is, can we get a deal on Ukraine with the border stuff? That's the political trade-off. So that the neoliberal, neoconservative people get what they want in a Ukraine package, the more hardline conservatives get what they want in a border measure. And I do not think that separating Israel necessarily makes everything collapse. They can do multiple bills, but there's still this opportunity to maybe bring the two wings together if Ukraine and borders still go together.
Okay, so you're talking about multiple bills here in terms of supplemental funding, but there's also a number of bills to contend with in terms of appropriations. I know they're going to try to pass a couple more this week, right? What exactly is the sequencing here?
We don't know yet how much the House is actually going to sincerely try to do. Okay. There was a detailed plan by Mike Johnson put forth as he was running for Speaker that said, here's how we're going to pass all our bills by November 17th. The House is not actually coming back this week until Wednesday, right. And they are going to vote, he said, on this Israel measure, which then leaves out Ukraine and the border by Thursday. They are going to have to vote this week. They have to legally vote within 2 legislative days on the expulsion of George Santos because of a measure that was filed that requires a vote on that. So there's a plan to vote on 3 more regular appropriations bills in the House. There are a lot of distractions, though, and that's also the case in the Senate. They've got about 10 amendments left to go in the Senate on this 3-bill package, so it's pretty slow going.
Before we bring in Mick Mulvaney, I want to ask you about the motion to vacate. There's a new effort, I guess, to increase the threshold on the motion. Does that have support in the House after this whole saga we just lived through?
That wasn't answered clearly during the speaker fight. And given that Mike Johnson did not make his candidacy contingent on people agreeing to change that, that seems more like a conversation that has to happen rather than something that's going to be forced in action sometime soon.
It was interesting in that interview he did with Sean Hannity last week, though. There was a moment in there, and it was Hannity was getting ready to ask another question, but Mike Johnson was kind of like, I think we're going to change it. I think we're going to change it. And then that's kind of all we got. I really
hope we're going to change it. We'll see. Jack, great to see you. Thanks, as always. Jack Fitzpatrick, our colleague at Bloomberg Government, right next door, Congress reporter who specializes in appropriations, not unlike Mick Mulvaney, who's with us now each Monday at this time. The former OMB director, I'm just putting that first because I never do. The co-founder of the Freedom Caucus, former acting chief of staff. There's something else in here I could put in front of it. It's good to see you, Mick, as always. Before we get into the real work, does this motion to vacate actually change? There's an effort right now, I believe it's Max Miller of Ohio, who says this should require 112 members. Do you agree?
Well, that was the rule under Nancy Pelosi. I think she changed it to the majority of the majority. Other than that brief, I think it was 2 or 4 year period, every speaker in history had to deal with the motion made by one person. And there's a lot of weight of history there. Then the question is not the number of people; it's the people you've got. So I'd be curious if Jack's still listening. I don't remember. I've been out of the House now about 7 years. I don't remember how to change the rules in the middle of a Congress. I think the burden is higher. The vote burden is higher during a Congress to change the rules than it is at the outset of every Congress. Typically at the beginning of each Congress, right after they pick a speaker, what happens is they adopt the rules package for that Congress, for that 2-year Congress. And they usually don't change that during the 2 years, but they can. I just think there's a higher burden. And if there is, it's highly unlikely they're going to change this. Look, everybody I've talked to said that while, that they're watching Mike very closely. I'm sure the appropriators are watching Mike very closely. The folks in the center of the Republican Party are watching him extraordinarily closely, and will hold him, his feet to the fire on making sure things work. In the folks I talked to, Joe Gailey, I don't get the impression there's a lot of appetite right now for either changing the rules on the speaker or, more importantly, having another speaker vote. I think Mike Johnson is going to be the speaker for the rest of this Congress. And then this discussion will go over into what happens after the next election.
Okay, Mick, so if we operate under that assumption that it will be Speaker Johnson at least until 2025, how much power and influence does Speaker Johnson really have, considering a lot of people didn't even really know who he was before he ultimately got the gavel? Is this really going to be Speaker Johnson in the front and Steve Scalise is the man behind the curtain? How do you think the power dynamics are going to work here?
Well, no. I mean, they're both from Louisiana. I assume they know each other. Again, I don't know Mike Johnson very well. He got there just as I was leaving. I know Steve Scalise very well. My guess is, to answer your question, that Mike Johnson will have roughly the same amount of authority that Kevin McCarthy had. It's an institutional sort of authority. What does the speaker get to do? He gets to pick which bills come to the floor. He gets to sort of, he's heavily involved in the committee chairmanships, but those have already been set. So the speaker has some authority, but not a tremendous amount of authority, especially when the margins are this tight. Keep in mind, Nancy Pelosi did not have a lot of authority when she was speaker. And that sounds strange to say, so let me take 2 seconds to explain why that is. She only had a margin of 4 or 5 votes. And while she had more control over her conference than Kevin McCarthy did or Mike Johnson will, she still had to essentially bring stuff to the floor that everybody could vote for. She couldn't pass anything that was controversial within her party. She had to sort of go wherever her majority pointed her. And that's the same sort of environment that Kevin was in. It will be the same environment that Mike Johnson is in.
Boy, a lot there. And I wonder your thoughts on Ukraine funding, specifically with Mitch McConnell. I keep referring to this, Mick, but I think it's fascinating. He's spending time appearing with Oksana Markarova today in Kentucky, of course, Ukraine's ambassador to the U.S., who is a known entity in our media here and has been for the better part of 2 years. This is not something that he's going to drop very easily. Is the speaker, do you think, already in touch with the Senate Republican leader on this?
Oh, sure, 100%. I think Jack actually in your previous segment hit the nail on the head, is that, look, a lot of Republican members, a lot of congressmen and women from both parties don't like these monster deals, right? Where you throw a bunch of crap in a bill, and if I want to get the one thing I like, I have to vote for 9 things that I don't like. They don't like that. It perverts the process. That's a bipartisan sort of objection. So when you hear the speaker say, I want to split off funding for Israel, my guess is there's going to be a good level of support for that. That does not necessarily kill Ukraine funding, because as Jack pointed out, it still allows the folks in the Senate to talk about marrying Ukraine funding with the border. So you could have, instead of one monster bill, you might have 2. You'd have one for Israel, which is a relatively small bill. Keep in mind the funding for Israel is about $14 billion, or roughly 12% of the overall bill. Have one bill for Israel and then another bill for Ukraine married with a border. That's the type of thing that sounds like it might have some life to it, and allow everybody to have their own vote yes on one, no on the other, but the House and the Senate still get to work their will without forcing down a monster omnibus bill down a lot of people's throats. So no, I'm cautiously optimistic that sounds like it is the way that things should play out.
Okay, so it's going to come down to the math and whether or not any of those individual things can get the adequate number of votes. And while we're thinking about numbers and counting votes, Mick, knowing all that work needs to be done, that there's so many bills that they're going to need to pass, is there any real chance that the Republicans kick George Santos out of the House and narrow their margin even further?
Ooh, really good question. I think Mike Johnson had said early on that wasn't going to be a priority. They had other stuff to do. I no longer
but the
think
expulsion resolution could come to the floor this week, and I just wonder how many people are going to vote yeah.
The question is, are they going to? Kaylee, and I'm asking you a question I don't know the answer to. Is that a privileged motion? Do they have to vote on it?
Yes, 2 legislative
Okay.
days is our understanding.
Okay, good. So it's sort of like the same as the motion to vacate. It has to sit for 2 days to ripen, but then it can be brought at any time. Keep in mind, there's 2 different things there. By the way, as soon as I say that out loud, people got the motion to vacate wrong. They said that after it was introduced, it would have to come up in 48 hours or 2 days. That's not true. It's after it was introduced, it could come up at any time after 2 days, as long as someone then brought the motion to the floor. If the motion to expel Santos falls into a sort of a similar category, you could file the motion and then you can bring the motion, force a vote anytime after 2 days, but it doesn't mean the vote automatically takes place after 2 days. So if you're a Republican from New York and you want to sort of beat your chest and say you want to get rid of George Santos, you could file the motion, but then not bring it up for a vote. I don't know. The George Santos thing is really, really weird. I don't know the guy, thank goodness. My guess is he's probably gone if it does come to a vote. And now that the speaker thing is sort of put to bed, maybe for the rest of this Congress, the Republicans be more likely to get rid of him because they don't care about that extra 1 vote in terms of a motion to vacate.
Well, I was compelled by his answer when asked about this on Fox last week. The speaker did reach for due process.
You weren't compelled by anything he said.
Are you kidding me? I don't even. Yes, right. Not due process was invoked, but not until after he talked about the thin margin in the House. Mick, here's Speaker Johnson.
Here's the reality, Sean. We have a 4-seat majority in the House. It is possible that that number may be reduced even more in the coming weeks and months, and so we'll have what may be the most razor-thin majority in the history of the Congress. We have no margin for error, and so George Santos is due process, right? He is. My understanding is I think he's appearing in a federal court tomorrow. And we have to allow due process to play itself out. That's what our system of justice is for.
He's not convicted. He's
not
charged.
Convicted. He's charged. And so if we're going to expel people from Congress just because they're charged with a crime, then, or accused, that's a problem.
So, Mick, we're just saying it out loud, right? This is not about due process. It's about keeping every vote you can.
Joe, and I owe you an apology. I thought you meant you were compelled by something that George Santos had said. I was taking you to task on that.
I'm compelled by everything George Santos says. That's not in question.
Look, at this point, I don't know if there's much of a difference between a 5-vote margin and a 4-vote margin. It's going to be tight regardless. So, I think the safe place for him to go is to due process. I think I respect that, and to say, look, the House will work its will. It is typical that if you're under indictment, you're supposed to. I know you're supposed to get off your committees, and I think George has already done that, or they kicked him off of his committee. I don't know what the precedent is on indictment. I don't know if there's anybody who's been expelled for an indictment. If not, then George is probably safe for a while. I think he pled not guilty late last week, right after that interview was taking place.
Yeah, pretty remarkable. He did. It was actually just hours after. Always wish we had more time with Mick Mulvaney. It's great to see you, Mick. Let's do it in a week. Just imagine what will happen between now and then. Mick Mulvaney here on Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew with Kaylee Lines. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We've got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, and the NASDAQ 100 index all holding close to session highs. Russell 2000 index of small cap shares higher by about 0.5%. But to put that in context, the S&P now higher by 1.1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index also up 1.1%, while the Dow is surging 1.5%. Right now, the Dow is up 485 points. S&P 500 Index up by 44 points. Stocks are higher. Oil now down 3.5%. Treasuries slipped as Israel's ground incursion into Gaza appears less extensive than investors had feared. 10-year yield now 4.87%, with a 2-year that's yielding 5.04%. Spot gold down $7.50 the ounce to $19.98, a drop now of 0.3%, while West Texas Intermediate crude is down 3.6%, $82.47 a barrel on West Texas Intermediate crude. Again, recapping here, stocks are higher. S&P 500 Index up 47, a gain of 1.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
So our historic auto workers strike appears to be over. This is just tentative now, but GM is the last piece to fall in place following Ford and Stellantis. I'm Joe Matthew along with Kaylee Lines. That news coming this morning. GM cutting a deal means the whole thing is done, right? This was all three of the big three.
Yeah, I mean, this is still tentative. It'll have to be approved by the union. So we're talking thousands of members that will have tens of thousands of them that have to sign off on this. But it does seem like this brings the beginning of the end of a 6-week-long strike. And what they got is very similar to what they got out of Ford and Stellantis. And when I say they, I mean the UAW. Yeah. 25% increase in wages, cost of living allowances included in this. And it's Stellantis' case, it was also an issue of making job security concessions as well.
Does Sean Fain get like a parade? Does he get, what do the members do for Sean Fain? Throw himself a parade?
Gift him some more camo shirts?
Right, it'll be all white camo. He must be writing a ripper right now for his next Facebook Live. I don't know, maybe you know when that happens. This is what he was sounding like last week when it was Ford, of course, we were talking about.
So we took our strike to a new phase and hit the companies with maximum effect. On Monday, we called on our UAW family at Sterling Heights Assembly to stand up. That is Stellantis' biggest and most profitable plant. On Tuesday, our UAW family at Arlington Assembly answered the call, and they went out on strike, shutting down GM's biggest and most profitable plant. Ford knew what was coming for them on Wednesday if we didn't get a deal. That was checkmate.
Checkmate. Maximum effect, he says. The strike delivered. And so Sean Fain may have just set a massive precedent for organized labor all over the country, which is another part of maybe the next part of this story.
Yeah, because we're thinking about a 4-year contract here. So there's the potential that all this song and dance happens again in 2028. And what's interesting is the UAW has asked other unions to time their contracts around the same. May 2028. Everybody could be going on strike.
Yeah, this is something, and he could probably be the one to pull it off, right?
Maybe it's a movement, not a moment. We'll see.
That was good.
Oh, thank you.
Want to talk to the professor, Professor Wheaton, Director of Labor Studies at Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations. Loved our conversation in the throes of this. Arthur Wheaton has helped to actually negotiate labor contracts before and is with us now that we have some news. It's good to see you, Professor. Thanks for joining us here once again on Bloomberg Sound On. Sean Fain got more than a lot of people thought he would get. How would you grade his level of success here?
I think he should receive a grade of an A+. I think he far exceeded what I thought possible for him to get. And it's important to remember that they got quite a bit for the workers that were hired before 2008, but they got massive increases for the new hires, temporaries, and what they refer to as in-progression workers. In some case, up to 165% increases in their wages.
Yeah, and it's not just about wages. As we know, there's other benefits at play here. We're still trying to figure out what exactly the details are. In the case of GM, as retirement benefits were a real sticking point, we understood in the conversation. So they must have ironed that out in some way. But net, looking at what the UAW has been able to pull off here with these automakers, is this something that is Shawn Fain and an auto workers union specific, or is this something that other labor forces are going to be able to replicate when they're dealing with companies going forward?
I think it's also building upon the success that the Teamsters had with UPS, and it's building upon the strong labor market we have to help in this case. But Shawn Fain deserves a tremendous amount of our respect and support for what he was able to accomplish, not just for the UAW, but for all workers, because people will start paying higher wages to avoid union drives at their places. So this should help all folks in manufacturing, especially in the auto sector.
Should we assume these are all ratified?
You can never assume anything. They thought they had a deal at Mack Truck, and that did not get ratified. I'm optimistic this one will get ratified, but I'm making no guarantees. But really big improvements, much higher than most analysts dreamed possible.
When you talk about how this creates something that is much bigger than the UAW, or a force that is greater than just the United Auto Workers, I also just wonder, thinking about auto workers that aren't at these big three, like those that are employed by, say, Tesla. Do you think we could see this force spread there?
Oh, absolutely. Tesla has had Elon Musk is like the saying he's paying as much as the UAW, so that there's no incentive to join the UAW because they pay decent wages. But these improvements for all of the different categories and classifications for the UAW means that's no longer the case. So they will have an incentive to pay higher or face additional organizing drives. And according to Shawn Fain, his phone's ringing off the hook for members trying to join with the UAW now that they've got big gains on the table. So if you get a big contract, it really helps in your organizing efforts.
Well, you tend to believe him. What did he refer to? The big three becoming the big five or six? That would have to include Tesla, I'm assuming, Kaylee. Professor, I want to ask you about the greater picture here. We still don't have an actors union contract. And as we look around the country, we can find any number of others that appear coiled and set to spring, not the smallest of which is in Las Vegas. We've got the Culinary Union on the Las Vegas Strip on the verge of what appears to be a massive labor action that would come on the eve of an F1 race, the Super Bowl, the Consumer Electronics Show, the type of strike that a lot of people would see and would likely get a lot of media coverage. We know how important that group is for Democrats coming up in the Nevada caucuses. Will also be held at the beginning of next year. It could be a collision when it comes to timing. Does this deal that we're seeing here in the recent action by the UAW prompt more labor actions like those?
It can. It shows success of collective bargaining works, and taking collective action can make a difference. And why would it happen with the same sorts of events you're talking about? Because you strike when you have the most leverage, and you want to make sure you can get the biggest gains. If there was nothing happening and you were during the heights of the pandemic and no one was going to Vegas, it wouldn't have as much impact. Now that you have Vegas starting to attract major events, that's when you have the most leverage at the table. That's when you want to try to get your piece of that economic action. So it only makes sense. And I think it's going to happen in other sectors as well. I hope they get the SAG-AFTRA ratified very quickly, and you're seeing President Biden already trying to make changes for artificial intelligence, and that's one of the issues actors are facing. So it's not just one small piece of the puzzle. We're a lot of people that are just workers and trying to get a little bit bigger piece of the pie.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up President Biden, because what you just said about the UAW deal being a testament to the power of collective bargaining and unions, that's essentially what the president said in the statement he put out after the news of the Stellantis UAW deal was announced. What grade would you give him in terms of his support of unions and his efforts here with the UAW, knowing that he did go visit the picket line in Detroit?
Being the first sitting president to ever walk a picket line in support of the union, I'd have to give him an A. I think that's at least an A for effort in trying to be there. I think if you try to give all of Congress a grade, that's a little harder to do. So you can only do so much as president, and I think he's got a good positive attitude towards union, along with about 70% of America has a positive attitude about unions.
Thought it was an E for effort, Professor. I don't know how that goes. That's very generous for Joe Biden. Does that mean that Donald Trump gets a different grade? He went out there to speak to union members as well.
I would have to give him a failing grade, because if you're going to go in support of union members, you might want to try going to a union facility. So he went to talk to non-union people in a non-union factory and trying to criticize the union that was on strike. So I think in terms of their efforts towards helping the workers, I would have to give Biden the edge on that, going to the people actually involved in the same cities they're involved.
All right, maybe this will be a thing on Sound On. We never did the grading thing before. Thank you for playing along. Arthur Wheaton, Director of Labor Studies, Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations. Don't assume, Kaylee, he says, that these deals will be ratified.
Yeah, I think we should probably be calling them tentative deals.
Yeah, fair enough. And you did.
There's
I think we both used that
here.
word. I think I'm going to give us both credit for that. But
A,
boy, that would be a
major
blow for Sean Fain. Yes, well done. That's an A, I think. That's an E for editorial. Never mind. Bail us out, Nancy. Let's get up to date on world and national news now. Nancy Lyons has that in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Israel says it is expanding its ground operation in Gaza, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says there will be no ceasefire.
The horrors that Hamas perpetrated on October 7th remind us that we will not realize the promise of a better future unless we, the civilized world, are willing to fight the barbarians.
Netanyahu is also dismissing calls for him to resign over security failures in the October 7th attack. Hackers obtained access to about 632,000 email addresses of employees at the Departments of Defense and Justice. That's according to a report from the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. Bloomberg's Ari Natter has more.
This is a part of the broader MOVE hack that came out last summer, where these hackers called CLOP were able to exploit this flaw in this file transfer system before it was patched. So this is part of the broader hack, which saw hundreds of companies affected, and millions of people had their data exposed.
Bloomberg's Ari Natter says the report notes the compromised data was generally of low sensitivity. A Denver court is hearing arguments today on whether former President Trump should be kept off that state's ballot because of his alleged role in the Capitol attack January 6th. Sean Grimsley represents the plaintiffs from the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics.
Trump incited a violent mob to attack our Capitol to stop the peaceful transfer of power under our Constitution.
Trump's attorneys argued that moving Trump from the ballot violates the rights of voters. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. Stocks are moving higher. We have got the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ trading at the best level of the day. Another leg higher since our last update, with the S&P now up by 52 points, a gain of 1.3%. The Dow is up 548, up 1.7%. NASDAQ, the composite index, up 156 for NASDAQ. That is a gain right now of 1.2%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.87%. The 2-year right now, 5.04%. Gold down $8.50 the ounce to $19.97, down 0.4%. While West Texas Intermediate crude is down 3.4%, $82.61 for a barrel of WTI. Lots of moving parts to the market this week between the jobs report Friday, Apple earnings Thursday, and the Fed decision on Wednesday. Sonal Desai is Chief Investment Officer at Franklin Templeton.
I think the market will be more focused on Apple. There's a limited amount the Fed can do right now, which would surprise the markets, except for doing something extremely unusual, which would be shocking if they either ruled out completely future rate hikes or actually raised rates, both of which are highly unlikely in my view.
And Apple up now by 1.4%. You can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Again, recapping, stocks are higher. S&P up 51, a gain right now of 1.3%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
As the Biden administration brings artificial intelligence back into the conversation today, this is not the first time, Kaylee Lines. It will not be the last. As Capitol Hill seeks some sort of legislative solution that won't be coming anytime soon, we can't even fund the government. The administration should get some credit for keeping the drumbeat on this. The president today signing another executive order is going to be talking about this momentarily here. To, I hate to say this again, to put guardrails around this emerging technology. How did I do? Would that go in the news release?
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up.
Because that doesn't mean anything to us, and we don't always know what we're talking about when it comes to AI.
Right.
To begin with.
And a lot of these executive orders are multi-pronged, and he's directing different departments and agencies to do different things, but broadly sweeping, it's just, let's try to do something about AI.
Yes, right.
And then it gets a little bit more specific, but to be honest, Joe, a lot of this still feels quite amorphous.
Sure, and it begins with the matter of privacy here and, of course, getting corporate partners to sign on. You were up on Capitol Hill when Elon Musk and everyone else came up there to brief lawmakers.
Yeah,
that was the all-senators briefing. Nothing followed that, though, right? That was a conversation and a photo op. And
yeah, Chuck Schumer had said this is going to be the first of many.
Right.
And really it was about education. It wasn't about actually trying to set policy. It was just trying to get members of Congress to wrap their head around this technology and hear from people so that they can proceed on a path forward. And yeah, I haven't heard much about what that path forward, at least legislatively, is, Joe.
Well, Bloomberg government was the first to get their hands on the order, on the EO. Here we go again. New standards on security and privacy protections for AI with far-reaching impacts on companies, developers such as Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet. Of course, these are the main AI concerns out there. Google's parent will be directed to put these models through safety tests and submit results to the government before their public release. So if you're teaching one of these models something, apparently you have to tell the government first. I don't know how that's going to work or exactly what they agreed to, but I don't think any of this is binding either.
Well, that's a very good point of whether these are just, agreements in principle.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we'll see about actual enforcement. Something else is asking the Commerce Department to help develop measures to counter public confusion about authentic content. This is when we start thinking about deep fakes and misinformation.
So, yeah, will this afternoon at the White House change anything? I don't know, but we wanted to talk to Caitlin Legacki about it, Four Corners Public Affairs partner, and spent time as an advisor to the Commerce Secretary in this administration. Caitlin, it's great to see you. I know this is something that you were actually briefing the Commerce Secretary on, and the Biden administration is trying to keep up with the flow here, and it feels like Washington is already behind. How important is this executive order today?
Yeah, Kaylee mentioned earlier that a lot of this still feels a little bit soft. I was actually surprised at how far this executive order went. We're obviously still in the early stages, but this was much more robust than I was expecting. I think they cover a breadth of topics, whether it's healthcare, education, national and economic security, that a lot of folks are concerned about. And so, like you said, this is a very important first step. But I think the most important thing is that at least the Biden administration and to an extent Capitol Hill have learned the lessons of, the social media debate on Capitol Hill. And they want to place some sort of guardrails on this before the horse gets too far out of the barn. Because, once these technologies take hold, it's so hard to reel them back in. And so I think this executive order is a really important first step to kind of, one, tell companies what the administration is concerned about, what they're looking at. But it also sent a message with its utilization of the Defense Production Act that they want companies and businesses at the table shaping solutions, but this administration is not afraid to go even further without them.
Okay, well, you say it kind of gives companies a better idea of what their concerns are and gives companies some directives as to what they should be practicing. But how hard is it to actually make what has been outlined in this executive order a reality, for it to have real effect?